Chapter 14. Undercurrents. It was during the year that followed their social repudiation, and the next, that Cowperwood achieved a keen realization of what it would mean to spend the rest of his days in social isolation, or at least confined in his sources of entertainment to a circle or element which constantly reminded him of the fact that he was not identified with the best, or at least not the most significant, however dull that might be. When he had first attempted to introduce Aileen into society, it was his idea that, however tame they might chance to find it to begin with, they themselves, once admitted, could make it into something very interesting and even brilliant. Since the time the Cowperwoods had been repudiated, however, they had found it necessary, if they wished any social diversion at all, to fall back upon such various minor elements as they could scrape an acquaintance with, passing actors and actresses, to whom occasionally they could give a dinner, artists and singers whom they could invite to the house upon gaining an introduction, and of course a number of the socially unimportant, such as the Hartsteads, Herxmers, Videras, Baileys, and others still friendly and willing to come in a casual way. Cowperwood found it interesting from time to time to invite a business friend, a lover of pictures, or some young artist to the house to dinner, or for the evening, and on these occasions Aileen was always present. The Addisons called or invited them occasionally, but it was a dull game, the more so since their complete defeat was thus all the more plainly indicated. This defeat, as Cowperwood kept reflecting, was really not his fault at all. He had been getting along well enough personally, if Aileen had only been a somewhat different type of woman. Nevertheless, he was in no way prepared to desert or reproach her. She had clung to him through his stormy prison days. She had encouraged him when he needed encouragement. He would stand by her and see what could be done a little later. But this ostracism was a rather dreary thing to endure. Besides, personally, he appeared to be becoming more and more interesting to men and to women. The men friends he had made he retained: Addison, Bailey, Videra, McKibbin, Rambeau, and others. There were women in society, a number of them, who regretted his disappearance, if not that of Aileen. Occasionally the experiment would be tried of inviting him without his wife. At first he refused, invariably. Later he went alone occasionally to a dinner party, without her knowledge. It was during this interregnum that Cowperwood for the first time clearly began to get the idea that there was a marked difference between him and Aileen intellectually and spiritually, and that while he might be in accord with her in many ways, emotionally, physically, idyllically, there were nevertheless many things which he could do alone which she could not do, heights to which he could rise where she could not possibly follow. Chicago society might be a negligible quantity, but he was now to contrast her sharply with the best of what the old world had to offer in the matter of femininity, for following their social expulsion in Chicago and his financial victory, he once more decided to go abroad. In Rome, at the Japanese and Brazilian embassies, where because of his wealth he gained introduction, and at the newly established Italian court, he encountered at a distance charming social figures of considerable significance: Italian countesses, English ladies of high degree, talented American women of strong artistic and social proclivities. As a rule, they were quick to recognize the charm of his manner, the incisiveness and grip of his mind, and to estimate at all its worth the high individuality of his soul. But he could also always see that Aileen was not so acceptable. She was too rich in her entourage, too showy. Her glowing health and beauty was a species of affront to the paler, more sublimated souls of many who were not in themselves unattractive. "Isn't that the typical American for you?" he heard a woman remark at one of those large, very general court receptions to which so many are freely admitted, and to which Aileen had been determined to go. He was standing aside, talking to an acquaintance he had made, an English-speaking Greek banker, stopping at the Grand Hotel, while Aileen promenaded with the banker's wife. The speaker was an Englishwoman. So gaudy, so self-conscious, and so naive. Cowperwood turned to look. It was Aileen, and the lady speaking was undoubtedly well-bred, thoughtful, good-looking. He had to admit that much that she said was true. But how were you to gauge a woman like Aileen, anyhow? She was not reprehensible in any way. Just a full-blooded animal glowing with the love of life, She was attractive to him. It was too bad that people of obviously more conservative tendencies were so opposed to her. Why could they not see what he saw? A kind of childish enthusiasm for luxury and show which sprang, perhaps, from the fact that in her youth she had not enjoyed the social opportunities which she needed and longed for. He felt sorry for her. At the same time, he was inclined to feel that perhaps now another type of woman would be better for him socially. If he had a harder type, one with keener artistic perceptions and a penchant for just the right social touch or note, how much better he would do. He came home bringing a Perugino, brilliant examples of Luini, Previtali, and Pinturicchio, this last a portrait of Cesare Borgia, which he picked up in Italy, to say nothing of 2 red African vases of great size that he found in Cairo, a tall, gilt Louis XV standard of carved wood that he discovered in Rome, 2 ornate candelabra from Venice for his walls, and a pair of Italian torcheras from Naples to decorate the corners of his library. It was thus, by degrees, that his art collection was growing. At the same time, it should be said, in the matter of women and the sex question, his judgment and views had begun to change tremendously. When he had first met Aileen, he had many keen intuitions regarding life and sex, and above all clear faith that he had a right to do as he pleased. Since he had been out of prison, and once more on his upward way, there had been many a stray glance cast in his direction. He had so often had it clearly forced upon him that he was fascinating to women. Although he had only so recently acquired Aileen legally, yet she was years old to him as a mistress, and the first engrossing, it had been almost all engrossing, enthusiasm was over. He loved her not only for her beauty, but for her faithful enthusiasm. But the power of others to provoke in him a momentary interest, and passion even, was something which he did not pretend to understand, explain, or moralize about. So it was, and so he was. He did not want to hurt Aileen's feelings by letting her know that his impulses thus wantonly strayed to others, but so it was. Not long after he had returned from the European trip, he stopped one afternoon in the one exclusive dry-goods store in State Street to purchase a tie. As he was entering, a woman crossed the aisle before him, from one counter to another, a type of woman which he was coming to admire, but only from a rather distant point of view, seeing them going here and there in the world. She was a dashing type, essentially smart and trig, with a neat figure, dark hair and eyes, an olive skin, small mouth, quaint nose. All in all, quite a figure for Chicago at the time. She had, furthermore, a curious look of current wisdom in her eyes, an air of saucy insolence which aroused Cowperwood's sense of mastery, his desire to dominate. To the look of provocation and defiance which she flung him for the fraction of a second, he returned a curiously leonine glare, which went over her like a dash of cold water. It was not a hard look, however, merely urgent and full of meaning. She was the vagrom-minded wife of a prosperous lawyer who was absorbed in his business and in himself. She pretended indifference for a moment after the first glance, but paused a little way off as if to examine some laces. Cowperwood looked after her to catch a second, fleeting, attracted look. He was on his way to several engagements which he did not wish to break, but he took out a notebook, wrote on a slip of paper the name of a hotel, and underneath, "Parlor, 2nd floor, Tuesday, 1 p.m. Passing by where she stood, he put it into her gloved hand, which was hanging by her side. The fingers closed over it automatically. She had noted his action. On the day and hour suggested, she was there, although he had given no name. That liaison, while delightful to him, was of no great duration. The lady was interesting, but too fanciful. Similarly, at the Henry Huddlestons', one of their neighbors at the first Michigan Avenue house they occupied, he encountered one evening at a small dinner party a girl of 23 who interested him greatly, for the moment. Her name was not very attractive, Ella F. Hubby, as he eventually learned, but she was not unpleasing. Her principal charm was a laughing, hoydenish countenance and roguish eyes. She was the daughter of a well-to-do commission merchant in South Water Street. That her interest should have been aroused by that of Cowperwood in her was natural enough. She was young, foolish, impressionable, easily struck by the glitter of her reputation, and Mrs. Huddleston had spoken highly of Cowperwood and his wife, and the great things he was doing and was going to do. When Ella saw him, and saw that he was still young-looking, with the love of beauty in his eyes and a force of presence which was not at all hard where she was concerned, she was charmed, and when Aileen was not looking, her glance kept constantly wandering to his, with a laughing signification of friendship and admiration. It was the most natural thing in the world for him to say to her, when they had adjourned to the drawing-room, that if she were in the neighborhood of his office some day, she might care to look in on him. The look he gave her was one of keen understanding, and brought a look of its own kind, warm and flushing, in return. She came, and there began a rather short liaison. It was interesting, but not brilliant. The girl did not have sufficient temperament to bind him beyond a period of rather idle investigation. There was still, for a little while, another woman whom he had known, a Mrs. Josephine Ledwell, a smart widow, who came primarily to gamble on the Board of Trade, but who began to see at once, on introduction, the charm of a flirtation with Cowperwood. She was a woman not unlike Aileen in type, a little older, not so good-looking, and of a harder, more subtle commercial type of mind. She rather interested Cowperwood, because she was so trig, self-sufficient, and careful. She did her best to lure him on to a liaison with her, which finally resulted, her apartment on the north side being the center of this relationship. It lasted perhaps 6 weeks. Through it all he was quite satisfied that he did not like her so very well. Anyone who associated with him had Aileen's present attractiveness to contend with, as well as the original charm of his first wife. It was no easy matter. It was during this period of social dullness, however, which somewhat resembled, though it did not exactly parallel, his first years with his first wife, that Cowperwood finally met a woman who was destined to leave a marked impression on his life. He could not soon forget her. Her name was Rita Solberg. She was the wife of Harold Solberg, a Danish violinist, who was then living in Chicago, a very young man. But she was not a Dane, and he was by no means a remarkable violinist, though he had unquestionably the musical temperament. You have perhaps seen the would-bes, the nearlies, the pretenders in every field, interesting people all, devoted with a kind of mad enthusiasm to the thing they wish to do. They manifest in some ways all the externals or earmarks of their professional traditions, and yet are as sounding brass and tinkling cymbals. You would have had to know Harold Solberg only a little while to appreciate that he belonged to this order of artists. He had a wild, stormy November eye, a wealth of loose, brownish-black hair combed upward from the temples, with one lock straggling Napoleonically down toward the eyes, cheeks that had almost a babyish tint to them, lips much too rich, red, and sensuous, a nose that was fine and large and full, but only faintly aquiline, and eyebrows and mustache that somehow seemed to flare quite like his errant and foolish soul. He had been sent away from Denmark, Copenhagen, because he had been a ne'er-do-well up to 25, and because he was constantly falling in love with women who would not have anything to do with him. Here in Chicago, as a teacher, with his small pension of $40 a month sent him by his mother, he had gained a few pupils, and by practicing a kind of erratic economy which kept him well-dressed or hungry by turns, he had managed to make an interesting showing and pull himself through. He was only 28 at the time he met Rita Greeno of Wichita, Kansas, and at the time they met Cowperwood, Harold was 34 and she 27. She had been a student at the Chicago Fine Arts School, and at various student affairs had encountered Harold when he seemed to play divinely, and when life was all romance and art. Given the spring, the sunshine on the lake, white sails of ships, a few walks and talks on pensive afternoons when the city swam in a golden haze, and the thing was done. There was a sudden Saturday afternoon marriage, a runaway day to Milwaukee, a return to the studio, now to be fitted out for two, and then kisses, 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 until love was satisfied or eased. But life cannot exist on that diet alone, and so by degrees the difficulties had begun to manifest themselves. Fortunately, the latter were not allied with sharp financial want. Rita was not poor. Her father conducted a small but profitable grain elevator at Wichita, and, after her sudden marriage, decided to continue her allowance, though this whole idea of art and music in its upper reaches was to him a strange, far-off, uncertain thing. A thin, meticulous, genial person, interested in small trade opportunities, and exactly suited to the rather sparse social life of Wichita, he found Harold as curious as a bomb, and preferred to handle him gingerly. Gradually, however, being a very human, if simple person, he came to be very proud of it, boasted in Wichita of Rita and her artist husband, invited them home to astound the neighbors during the summertime, and the fall brought his almost farmer-like wife on to see them and to enjoy trips, sightseeing, studio teas. It was amusing, typically American, naive, almost impossible from many points of view. Rita Solberg was of the semi-phlegmatic type, soft, full-blooded, with a body that was going to be fat at 40 but which at present was deliciously alluring. Having soft, silky, light brown hair the color of light dust, and moist grey-blue eyes, with a fair skin and even, white teeth, she was flatteringly self-conscious of her charms. She pretended, in a gay, childlike way, to be unconscious of the thrill she sent through many susceptible males, and yet she knew well enough all the while what she was doing, and how she was doing it. It pleased her so to do. She was conscious of the wonder of her smooth, soft arms and neck, the fullness and seductiveness of her body, the grace and perfection of her clothing, or at least the individuality and taste which she made them indicate. She could take an old straw hat form, a ribbon, a feather, or a rose, and with an innate artistry of feeling, turn it into a bit of millinery which somehow was just the effective thing for her. She chose naive combinations of white and blues, pinks and white, browns and pale yellows, which somehow suggested her own soul, and topped them with great sashes of silky brown, or even red, ribbon tied about her waist, and large, soft-brimmed, face-haloing hats. She was a graceful dancer, could sing a little, could play feelingly, sometimes brilliantly, and could draw. Her art was a makeshift, however. She was no artist. The most significant thing about her was her moods and her thoughts, which were uncertain, casual, anarchic. Rita Solberg, from the conventional point of view, was a dangerous person, and yet from her own point of view, at this time, she was not so at all, just dreamy and sweet. A part of the peculiarity of her state was that Solberg had begun to disappoint Rita sorely. Truth to tell, he was suffering from that most terrible of all maladies, uncertainty of soul and inability to truly find himself. At times he was not sure whether he was cut out to be a great violinist or a great composer, or merely a great teacher, which last he was never willing really to admit. "I am an artiste," he was fond of saying. "Oh, how I suffer from my temperament." And again, "These dogs, these cows, these pigs." This of other people. The quality of his playing was exceedingly erratic, even though at times it attained a kind of subtlety, tenderness, awareness, and charm which brought him some attention. As a rule, however, it reflected the chaotic state of his own brain. He would play violently, feverishly, with a wild passionateness of gesture which robbed him of all ability to control his own technique. "Oh, Harold," Rita used to exclaim at first ecstatically. Later on, she was not so sure. Life and character must really get somewhere to be admirable, and Harold really and truly did not seem to be getting anywhere. He taught, stormed, dreamed, wept, but he ate 3 meals a day, Rita noticed, and he took an excited interest at times in other women. To be the be-all and end-all of some one man's life was the least that Rita could conceive or concede as the worth of her personality. And so as the years went on and Harold began to be unfaithful, first in moods, transports, then in deeds, her mood became dangerous. She counted them up: a girl music pupil, then an art student, then the wife of a banker at whose house Harold played socially. There followed strange, sullen moods on the part of Rita, visits home, groveling repentances on the part of Harold, tears, violent, passionate reunions, and then the same thing over again. What would you? Rita was not jealous of Harold any more. She had lost faith in his ability as a musician, but she was disappointed that her charms were not sufficient to blind him to all others. That was the fly in the ointment. It was an affront to her beauty, and she was still beautiful. She was unctuously full-bodied, not quite so tall as Aileen, not really as large, but rounder and plumper, softer and more seductive. Physically, she was not well set up, so vigorous. But her eyes and mouth and the roving character of her mind held a strange lure. Mentally, she was much more aware than Aileen, much more precise in her knowledge of art, music, literature, and current events, and in the field of romance she was much more vague and alluring. She knew many things about flowers, precious stones, insects, birds, characters in fiction, and poetic prose and verse generally. At the time the Cowperwoods first met the Solbergs, the latter still had their studio in the new Arts Building, and all was seemingly as serene as a May morning, only Harold was not getting along very well. He was drifting. The meeting was at a tea given by the Hartsteads, with whom the Cowperwoods were still friendly, and Harold played. Aileen, who was there alone, seeing a chance to brighten her own life a little, invited the Solbergs, who seemed rather above the average, to her house to a musical evening. They came. On this occasion Cowperwood took one look at Solberg and placed him exactly. An erratic, emotional temperament, he thought. Probably not able to place himself for want of consistency and application. But he liked him after a fashion. Solberg was interesting as an artistic type or figure, quite like a character in a Japanese print might be. He greeted him pleasantly. "And Mrs. Solberg, I suppose," he remarked feelingly, catching a quick suggestion of the rhythm and sufficiency and naive taste that went with her. She was in simple white and blue, small blue ribbons threaded above lacy flounces in the skirt. Her arms and throat were deliciously soft and bare. Her eyes were quick and yet soft and babyish. Petted eyes. "You know," she said to him with a peculiar rounded formation of the mouth, which was a characteristic of her when she talked. A pretty, pouty mouth. "I thought we would never get here at all. There was a fire." She pronounced it, fire. "At 12th Street. The 12th was 12th in her mouth. "And the engines were all about there. Oh, such sparks and smoke, and the flames coming out of the windows. The flames were a very dark red, almost orange and black. They're pretty when they're that way, don't you think so?" Cowperwood was charmed. "Indeed I do," he said, genially, using a kind of superior and yet sympathetic air, which he could easily assume on occasions. He felt as though Mrs. Solberg might be a charming daughter to him. She was so cuddling and shy, and yet he could see that she was definite and individual. Her arms and face, he told himself, were lovely. Mrs. Solberg only saw before her a smart, cold, exact man, capable, very, she presumed, with brilliant, incisive eyes. How different from Harold, she thought, who would never be anything much, not even famous. "I'm so glad you brought your violin," Aileen was saying to Harold, who was in another corner. "I've been looking forward to your coming to play for us." "Very nice of you, I'm sure," Solberg replied, with his sweety drawl. "Such a nice place you have here. All these lovely books, and jade and glass." He had an unctuous, yielding way which was charming, Aileen thought. He should have a strong, rich woman to take care of him. He was like a stormy, erratic boy. After refreshments were served, Solberg played. Cowperwood was interested by his standing figure, his eyes, his hair, but he was much more interested in Mrs. Solberg, to whom his look constantly strayed. He watched her hands on the keys, her fingers, the dimples at her elbows. What an adorable mouth, he thought, and what light, fluffy hair. But more than that, there was a mood that invested it all, a bit of tinted colour of the mind that reached him and made him sympathetic and even passionate toward her. She was the kind of woman he would like. She was somewhat like Aileen when she was 6 years younger. Aileen was now 33 and Mrs. Solberg 27. Only Aileen had always been more robust, more vigorous, less nebulous. Mrs. Solberg, he finally thought it out for himself, was like the rich, tinted interior of a southern sea oyster shell, warm, colourful, delicate. But there was something firm there, too. Nowhere in society had he seen anyone like her. She was rapt, sensuous, beautiful. He kept his eyes on her until finally she became aware that he was gazing at her, and then she looked back at him in an arch, smiling way, fixing her mouth in a potent line. Cowperwood was captivated. Was she vulnerable? Was his one thought. Did that faint smile mean anything more than mere social complacence? Probably not. But could not a temperament so rich and full be awakened to feeling by his own? When she was through playing, he took occasion to say, "Would you like to stroll into the gallery? Are you fond of pictures?" He gave her his arm. "Now you know," said Mrs. Solberg quaintly, very captivatingly, he thought, because she was so pretty. "At one time I thought I was going to be a great artist. Isn't that funny? I sent my father one of my drawings, inscribed 'To whom I owe it all.' You would have to see the drawing to see how funny that is." She laughed softly. Cowperwood responded with a refreshed interest in life. Her laugh was as grateful to him as a summer wind. "See," he said gently as they entered the room, aglow with the soft light produced by guttered jets. "Here is a Luini, bought last winter." It was The Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine. He paused while she surveyed the rapt expression of the attenuated saint. "And here," he went on, "is my greatest find so far." They were before the crafty countenance of Cesare Borgia, painted by Pinturicchio. "What a strange face," commented Mrs. Solberg naively. "I didn't know anyone had ever painted him. He looks somewhat like an artist himself, doesn't he?" She had never read the involved and quite satanic history of this man, and only knew the rumor of his crimes and machinations. "He was, in his way," smiled Cowperwood, who had had an outline of his life, and that of his father, Pope Alexander VI, furnished him at the time of the purchase. Only so recently had his interest in Cesare Borgia began. Mrs. Solberg scarcely gathered the sly humor of it. "Oh, yes, and here is Mrs. Cowperwood," she commented, turning to the painting by Van Beers. "It's high in key, isn't it?" she said loftily, but with an innocent loftiness that appealed to him. He liked spirit and some presumption in a woman. "What brilliant colors! I like the idea of the garden and the clouds." She stepped back, and Cowperwood, interested only in her, surveyed the line of her back and the profile of her face. Such coordinated perfection of line and color, where every motion weaves and sings, he might have commented. Instead he said, "That was in Brussels. The clouds were an afterthought, and that vase on the wall, too." "It's very good, I think," commented Mrs. Solberg, and moved away. "How do you like this Israels?" he asked. It was the painting called The Frugal Meal. "I like it," she said, "and also your Bastien Lepage," referring to the forge. "But I think your old masters are much more interesting. If you get many more, you ought to put them together in a room. Don't you think so? I don't care for your Gérôme very much." She had a cute drawl which he considered infinitely alluring. "Why not?" asked Cowperwood. "Oh, it's rather artificial, don't you think so? I like the color, but the women's bodies are too perfect, I should say. It's very pretty, though." He had little faith in the ability of women aside from their value as objects of art, and yet now and then, as in this instance, they revealed a sweet insight which sharpened his own. Aileen, he reflected, would not be capable of making a remark such as this. She was not as beautiful now as this woman, not as alluringly simple, naive, delicious, nor yet as wise. Mrs. Solberg, he reflected shrewdly, had a kind of fool for a husband. Would she take an interest in him, Frank Cowperwood? Would a woman like this surrender on any basis, outside of divorce and marriage? He wondered. On her part, Mrs. Solberg was thinking what a forceful man Cowperwood was, and how close he had stayed by her. She felt his interest, for she had often seen these symptoms in other men and knew what they meant. She knew the pull of her own beauty, and while she heightened it as artfully as she dared, yet she kept aloof, too, feeling that she had never met anyone as yet for whom it was worthwhile to be different. But Cowperwood, he needed someone more soulful than Aileen, she thought. Chapter 15. A New Affection. The growth of a relationship between Cowperwood and Rita Sohlberg was fostered quite accidentally by Aileen, who took a foolishly sentimental interest in Harold, which yet was not based on anything of real meaning. She liked him because he was a superlatively gracious, flattering, emotional man where women, pretty women, were concerned. She had some idea she could send him pupils, and somehow it was nice to call at the Sohlberg studio. Her social life was dull enough as it was, so she went, and Cowperwood, mindful of Mrs. Sohlberg, came also. Shrewd to the point of destruction, he encouraged Aileen in her interest in them. He suggested that she invite them to dinner, that they give a musical at which Sohlberg could play and be paid. There were boxes at the theatres, tickets for concerts sent, invitations to drive Sundays and other days. The very chemistry of life seems to play into the hands of a situation of this kind. Once Cowperwood was thinking vividly, forcefully of her, Rita began to think in like manner of him. Hourly he grew more attractive, a strange, gripping man. Beset by his mood, she was having the devil's own time with her conscience. Not that anything had been said as yet, but he was investing her, gradually beleaguering her, sealing up, apparently, one avenue after another of escape. One Thursday afternoon, when neither Aileen nor he could attend the Sohlberg tea, Mrs. Sohlberg received a magnificent bunch of Jacqueminot roses. "For your nooks and corners," said a card. She knew well enough from whom it came, and what it was worth. There were all of $50 worth of roses. It gave her breath of a world of money that she had never known. Daily she saw the name of his banking and brokerage firm advertised in the papers. Once she met him in Merrill's store at noon, and he invited her to lunch, but she felt obliged to decline. Always he looked at her with such straight, vigorous eyes. To think that her beauty had done, or was doing this. Her mind, quite beyond herself, ran forward to an hour when perhaps this eager, magnetic man would take charge of her in a way never dreamed of by Harold. But she went on practicing, shopping, calling, reading, brooding over Harold's inefficiency, and stopping, oddly sometimes, to think. The etherealized grip of Cowperwood upon her. Those strong hands of his, how fine they were, and those large, soft, hard, incisive eyes. The Puritanism of Wichita, modified some time since by the art life of Chicago, such as it was having a severe struggle with the manipulative subtlety of the ages, represented in this man. "You know you are very elusive," he said to her one evening at the theatre, when he sat behind her during the entr'acte, and Harold and Aileen had gone to walk in the foyer. The hubbub of conversation drowned the sound of anything that might be said. Mrs. Sohlberg was particularly pleasing in a lacy evening gown. "No," she replied amusedly, flattered by his attention and acutely conscious of his physical nearness. By degrees, she had been yielding herself to his mood, thrilling at his every word. "It seems to me I'm very stable," she went on. "I'm certainly substantial enough." She looked at her full, smooth arm lying on her lap. Cowperwood, who was feeling all the drag of her substantiality, but in addition the wonder of her temperament, which was so much richer than Aileen's, was deeply moved. Those little blood moods that no words ever, or rarely, indicate, were coming to him from her. Faint, zephyr-like emanations of emotions, moods, and fancies in her mind, which allured him. She was like Aileen in animality, but better, still sweeter, more delicate, much richer spiritually. Or was he just tired of Aileen for the present, he asked himself at times. No, he told himself, that could not be. Rita Sohlberg was by far the most pleasing woman he had ever known. Yes, but elusive just the same, he went on, leaning toward her. You remind me of something that I can find no word for, a bit of color, or a perfume or tone, a flash of something. I follow you in my thoughts all the time now. Your knowledge of art interests me. I like your playing. It is like you. You make me think of delightful things that have nothing to do with the ordinary run of my life. Do you understand?" "It is very nice," she said, "if I do." She took a breath, softly, dramatically. "You make me think vain things, you know." Her mouth was a delicious O. "You paint a pretty picture." She was warm, flushed, suffused with a burst of her own temperament. "You are like that," he went on insistently. "You make me feel like that all the time. You know," he added, leaning over a chair, "I sometimes think you have never lived. There is so much that would complete your perfectness. I should like to send you abroad, or take you. Anyhow, you should go. You are very wonderful to me. Do you find me at all interesting to you?" "Yes, but—" She paused. "You know I'm afraid of all this, and of you." Her mouth had that same delicious formation which had first attracted him. "I don't think we had better talk like this, do you? Harold is very jealous, or would be. What do you suppose Mrs. Cowperwood would think?" "I know very well, but we needn't stop to consider that now, need we? It will do her no harm to let me talk to you. Life is between individuals, Rita. You and I have very much in common. Don't you see that? You are infinitely the most interesting woman I have ever known. You are bringing me something I have never known. Don't you see that? I want you to tell me something truly. Look at me. You are not happy as you are you? Not perfectly happy?" "No." She smoothed her fan with her fingers. "Are you happy at all?" "I thought I was once. I'm not any more, I think." "It is so plain why," he commented. "You are so much more wonderful than your place gives you scope for. You are an individual, not an acolyte to swing a censer for another. Mr. Solberg is very interesting, but you can't be happy that way. It surprises me you haven't seen it." "Oh," she explained with a touch of weariness, "but perhaps I have." He looked at her keenly, and she thrilled. "I don't think we'd better talk so here," she replied. "You'd better be—" He laid his hand on the back of her chair, almost touching her shoulder. "Rita," he said, using her given name again. "You wonderful woman." "Oh," she breathed. Cowperwood did not see Mrs. Solberg again for over a week. 10 days exactly, when one afternoon Aileen came for him in a new kind of trap, having stopped first to pick up the Solbergs. Harold was up in front with her, and she had left a place behind for Cowperwood with Rita. She did not in the vaguest way suspect how interested he was. His manner was so deceptive. Aileen imagined that she was the superior woman of the two, the better looking, the better dressed, hence the more ensnaring. She could not guess what allure this woman's temperament had for Cowperwood, who was so brisk, so dynamic, seemingly unromantic, but who just the same in his nature concealed, under a very forceful exterior, a deep underlying element of romance and fire. "This is charming," he said, sinking down beside Rita. "What a fine evening. And the nice straw hat with the roses and the nice linen dress. My, my." The roses were red. The dress white, with thin, green ribbon run through it here and there. She was keenly aware of the reason for his enthusiasm. He was so different from Harold, so healthy and out-of-doorish, so able. Today Harold had been in tantrums over fate, life, his lack of success. "Oh, I shouldn't complain so much if I were you," she had said to him bitterly. "You might work harder and storm less." This had produced a scene which she had escaped by going for a walk. Almost at the very moment when she had returned, Aileen had appeared. It was a way out. She had cheered up and accepted, dressed. So had Solberg. Apparently, smiling and happy, they had set out on the drive. Now, as Cowperwood spoke, she glanced about her contentedly. "I'm lovely," she thought, "and he loves me. How wonderful it would be if we dared." But she said aloud, "I'm not so very nice. It's just the day, don't you think so? It's a simple dress. I'm not very happy, though, tonight, either." "What's the matter?" he asked cheeringly, the rumble of the traffic destroying the carrying power of their voices. He leaned toward her, very anxious to solve any difficulty which might confront her, perfectly willing to ensnare her by kindness. "Isn't there something I can do? We're going now for a long ride to the pavilion in Jackson Park, and then after dinner we'll come back by moonlight. Won't that be nice? You must be smiling now, and like yourself. Happy. You have no reason to be otherwise, that I know of. I will do anything for you that you want done, that can be done. You can have anything you want that I can give you. What is it? You know how much I think of you. If you leave your affairs to me, you would never have any troubles of any kind." "Oh, it isn't anything you can do. Not now, anyhow. My affairs. Oh, yes. What are they? Very simple, all." She had that delicious atmosphere of remoteness, even from herself. He was enchanted. "But you are not simple to me, Rita," he said softly. "Nor are your affairs. They concern me very much. You are so important to me. I have told you that. Don't you see how true it is? You are a strange complexity to me. Wonderful. I'm mad over you. Ever since I saw you last, I've been thinking. If you have troubles, let me share them. You are so much to me, my only trouble. I can fix your life. Join it with mine. I need you, and you need me." "Yes," she said, "I know." Then she paused. "It's nothing much," she went on, "just a quarrel." "What over?" "Over me, really." The mouth was delicious. "I can't swing the censer always, as you say." That thought of his had stuck. "It's all right now, though. Isn't the day lovely? Beautiful." Cowperwood looked at her and shook his head. She was such a treasure. So inconsequential. Aileen, busy driving and talking, could not see or hear. She was interested in Solberg, and the southward crush of vehicles on Michigan Avenue was distracting her attention. As they drove swiftly past budding trees, kempt lawns, fresh-made flower-beds, open windows, the whole seductive world of spring, Cowperwood felt as though life had once more taken a fresh start. His magnetism, if it had been visible, would have enveloped him like a glittering aura. Mrs. Solberg felt that this was going to be a wonderful evening. The dinner was at the park, an open-air chicken a la Maryland affair, with waffles and champagne to help out. Aileen, flattered by Solberg's gaiety under her spell, was having a delightful time, jesting, toasting, laughing, walking on the grass. Solberg was making love to her in a foolish, inconsequential way, as many men were inclined to do, but she was putting him off gaily with "silly boy" and "hush." She was so sure of herself that she was free to tell Cowperwood afterward how emotional he was, and how she had to laugh at him. Cowperwood, quite certain that she was faithful, took it all in good part. Solberg was such a dunce, and such a happy convenience ready to his hand. "He's not a bad sort," he commented. "I rather like him, though I don't think he's so much of a violinist." After dinner they drove along the lake shore and out through an open bit of tree-blocked prairie land, the moon shining in a clear sky, filling the fields and topping the lake with a silvery effulgence. Mrs. Solberg was being inoculated with the virus Cowperwood, and it was taking deadly effect. The tendency of her own disposition, however lethargic it might seem, once it was stirred emotionally, was to act. She was essentially dynamic and passionate. Cowperwood was beginning to stand out in her mind as the force that he was. It would be wonderful to be loved by such a man. There would be an eager, vivid life between them. It frightened and drew her like a blazing lamp in the dark. To get control of herself, she talked of art, people, of Paris, Italy, and he responded in like strain. But all the while he smoothed her hand, and once, under the shadow of some trees, he put his hand to her hair, turned her face, and put his mouth softly to her cheek. She flushed, trembled, turned pale in the grip of this strange storm, but drew herself together. It was wonderful. Heaven. Her old life was obviously going to pieces. "Listen," he said guardedly. "Will you meet me tomorrow at 3 just beyond the Rush Street Bridge? I will pick you up promptly. You won't have to wait a moment." She paused, meditating. dreaming, almost hypnotized by his strange world of fancy. "Will you?" he asked eagerly. "Wait," she said softly. "Let me think. Can I?" She paused. "Yes," she said after a time, drawing in a deep breath. "Yes," as if she had arranged something in her mind. "My sweet," he whispered, pressing her arm, while he looked at her profile in the moonlight. "But I'm doing a great deal," she replied softly, a little breathless and a little pale. Chapter 16. A Fateful Interlude. Cowperwood was enchanted. He kept the proposed tryst with eagerness, and found her all that he had hoped. She was sweeter, more colourful, more elusive than anybody he had ever known. In their charming apartment on the north side, which he had once engaged, and where he sometimes spent mornings, evenings, afternoons, as opportunity afforded, he studied her with the most critical eye, and found her almost flawless. She had that boundless value which youth and a certain insouciance of manner contribute. There was, delicious to relate, no melancholy in her nature, but a kind of innate sufficiency, which neither looked forward to nor back upon troublesome ills. She loved beautiful things, but was not extravagant, and what interested him and commanded his respect was that no urgings of his toward prodigality, however subtly advanced, could affect her. She knew what she wanted, spent carefully, bought tastefully, arrayed herself in ways which appealed to him as the flowers did. His feeling for her became at times so great that he wished, one might almost have said, to destroy it, to appease the urge and allay the pull in himself, but it was useless. The charm of her endured. His transports would leave her refreshed, apparently, prettier, more graceful than ever, it seemed to him, putting back her ruffled hair with her hand, mouthing at herself prettily in the glass, thinking of many remote, delicious things at once. "Do you remember that picture we saw in the art store the other day, Algernon?" she would drawl, calling him by his second name, which she had adopted for herself as being more suitable to his moods when with her, and more pleasing to her. Cowperwood had protested, but she held to it. "Do you remember that lovely blue of the old man's coat?" It was an adoration of the Magi. "Wasn't that beautiful?" She drawled so sweetly, and fixed her mouth in such an odd way that he was impelled to kiss her. "You clover blossom," he would say to her, coming over and taking her by the arms. "You sprig of cherry bloom. You Dresden china dream. Now are you going to muss my hair when I've just managed to fix it?" The voice was the voice of careless, genial innocence. And the eyes. "Yes, I am, minx." "Yes, but you mustn't smother me, you know. Really, you know, you almost hurt me with your mouth. Aren't you going to be nice to me?" "Yes, sweet. But I want to hurt you, too." "Well, then, if you must." But for all his transports, the lure was still there. She was like a butterfly, he thought, yellow and white or blue and gold, fluttering over a hedge of wild rose. In these intimacies it was that he came quickly to understand how much she knew of social movements and tendencies, though she was just an individual of the outer fringe. She caught at once a clear understanding of his social point of view, his art ambition, his dreams of something better for himself in every way. She seemed to see clearly that he had not as yet realized himself, that Aileen was not just the woman for him, though she might be one. She talked of her own husband, after a time, in a tolerant way, his foibles, defects, weaknesses. She was not unsympathetic, he thought, just weary of a state that was not properly balanced either in love, ability, or insight. Cowperwood had suggested that she could take a larger studio for herself and Harold, do away with the petty economies that had hampered her and him, and explain it all on the grounds of a larger generosity on the part of her family. At first she objected, but Cowperwood was tactful, and finally brought it about. He again suggested a little while later that she should persuade Harold to go to Europe. There would be the same ostensible reason, additional means from her relatives. Mrs. Solberg, thus urged, petted, made over, assured, came finally to accept his liberal rule, to bow to him. She became as contented as a cat. With caution she accepted of his largesse, and made the cleverest use of it she could. For something over a year neither Solberg nor Aileen was aware of the intimacy which had sprung up. Solberg, easily bamboozled, went back to Denmark for a visit, then to study in Germany. Mrs. Solberg followed Cowperwood to Europe the following year. At Aix-les-Bains, Biarritz, Paris, even London, Aileen never knew that there was an additional figure in the background. Cowperwood was trained by Rita into a really finer point of view. He came to know better music, books, even the facts. She encouraged him in his idea of a representative collection of the old masters, and begged him to be cautious in his selection of moderns. He felt himself to be delightfully situated indeed. The difficulty with this situation, as with all such, where an individual ventures thus buccaneeringly on the sea of sex, is the possibility of those storms which result from misplaced confidence, and from our built-up system of ethics relating to property in women. To Cowperwood, however, who was a law unto himself, who knew no law except such as might be imposed upon him by his lack of ability to think, this possibility of entanglement, wrath, rage, pain, offered no particular obstacle. It was not at all certain that any such thing would follow. Where the average man might have found one such liaison difficult to manage, Cowperwood, as we have seen, had previously entered on several such affairs, almost simultaneously, and now he had ventured on yet another, in the last instance with much greater feeling and enthusiasm. The previous affairs had been emotional makeshifts at best, more or less idle philanderings, in which his deeper moods and feelings were not concerned. In the case of Mrs. Solberg all this was changed. For the present at least, she was really all in all to him. But this temperamental characteristic of his relating to his love of women, his artistic if not emotional subjection to their beauty, and the mystery of their personalities, led him into still a further affair, and this last was not so fortunate in its outcome. Antoinette Novak had come to him fresh from a West Side high school and a Chicago business college, and had been engaged as his private stenographer and secretary. This girl had blossomed forth into something exceptional, as American children of foreign parents are wont to do. You would have scarcely believed that she, with her fine, lithe body, her good taste in dress, her skill in stenography, bookkeeping, and business details, could be the daughter of a struggling Pole who had first worked in the Southwest Chicago steel mills, and who later had kept a fifth-rate cigar, news, and stationery store in the Polish district, the merchandise of playing cards and a back room for idling and casual gaming being the principal reason for its existence. Antoinette, whose first name had not been Antoinette at all, but Minka, the Antoinette having been borrowed by her from an article in one of the Chicago Sunday papers, was a fine, dark, brooding girl, ambitious and hopeful, who 10 days after she had accepted her new place was admiring Cowperwood, and following his every daring movement with almost excited interest. To be the wife of such a man, she thought, to even command his interest, let alone his affection, must be wonderful. After the dull world she had known, it seemed dull compared to the upper, rarefied realms which she was beginning to glimpse through him, and after the average men in the real estate office over the way, where she had first worked, Cowperwood, in his good clothes, his remote mood, his easy, commanding manner, touched the most ambitious chord of her being. One day she saw Aileen sweep in from her carriage wearing warm brown furs, smart polished boots, a street suit of corded brown wool, and a fur toque, sharpened and emblazoned by a long, dark red feather, which shot upward like a dagger or a quill pen. Antoinette hated her. She conceived herself to be better, or as good at least. Why was life divided so unfairly? What sort of a man was Cowperwood, anyhow? One night, after she had written out a discreet but truthful history of himself, which he had dictated to her, and which she had sent to the Chicago newspapers for him soon after the opening of his brokerage office in Chicago, she went home and dreamed of what he had told her, only altered, of course, as in dreams. She thought that Cowperwood stood beside her in his handsome private office in La Salle Street and asked her, "Antoinette, what do you think of me?" Antoinette was nonplussed but brave. In her dream she found herself intensely interested in him. "Oh, I don't know what to think. I'm so sorry," was her answer. Then he laid his hand on hers, on her cheek, and she awoke. She began thinking, what a pity, what a shame that such a man should ever have been in prison. He was so handsome. He had been married twice. Perhaps his first wife was very homely or very mean-spirited. She thought of this, and the next day went to work meditatively. Cowperwood, engrossed in his own plans, was not thinking of her at present. He was thinking of the next moves in his interesting gas war, and Aileen, seeing her one day, merely considered her an underling. The woman in business was such a novelty that as yet she was déclassée. Aileen really thought nothing of Antoinette at all. Somewhat over a year after Cowperwood had become intimate with Mrs. Solberg, his rather practical business relations with Antoinette Novak took on a more intimate color. What shall we say of this? That he had already wearied of Mrs. Solberg? Not in the least. He was desperately fond of her. Or that he despised Aileen, whom he was thus grossly deceiving? Not at all. She was to him at times as attractive as ever, perhaps more so for the reason that her self-imagined rights were being thus roughly infringed upon. He was sorry for her, but inclined to justify himself on the ground that these other relations, with possibly the exception of Mrs. Solberg, were not enduring. If it had been possible to marry Mrs. Solberg, he might have done so, and he did speculate at times as to whether anything would ever induce Aileen to leave him. But this was more or less idle speculation. He rather fancied they would live out their days together, seeing that he was able thus easily to deceive her. But as for a girl like Antoinette Novak, she figured in that braided symphony of mere sex attraction, which somehow makes up that geometric formula of beauty which rules the world. She was charming in a dark way, beautiful, with eyes that burned with an unsatisfied fire, and Cowperwood, although at first only in the least moved by her, became by degrees interested in her, wondering at the amazing, transforming power of the American atmosphere. "Are your parents English, Antoinette?" he asked her one morning, with that easy familiarity which he assumed to all underlings and minor intellects, an air that could not be resented in him, and which was usually accepted as a compliment. Antoinette, clean and fresh in a white shirt-waist, a black walking skirt, a ribbon of black velvet about her neck, and her long black hair laid in a heavy braid low over her forehead and held close by a white celluloid comb, looked at him with pleased and grateful eyes. She had been used to such different types of men. The earnest, fiery, excitable, sometimes drunken and swearing men of her childhood, always striking, marching, praying in the Catholic churches, and then the men of the business world, crazy over money, and with no understanding of anything save some few facts about Chicago and its monetary possibilities. In Cowperwood's office, taking his letters and hearing him talk in his quick, genial way with old Lachlan, Sippens, and others, she had learned more of life than she had ever dreamed existed. He was like a vast open window, out of which she was looking upon an almost illimitable landscape. "No, sir," she replied, dropping her slim, firm, white hands, holding a black lead pencil restfully on her notebook. She smiled, quite innocently, because she was pleased. "I thought not," he said. "And yet you're American enough." "I don't know how it is," she said, quite solemnly. "I have a brother who is quite as American as I am. We don't either of us look like our father or mother." "What does your brother do?" he asked indifferently. "He's one of the weighers at Arneal & Co. He expects to be a manager sometime." She smiled. Cowperwood looked at her speculatively, and after a momentary return glance, she dropped her eyes. Slowly, in spite of herself, a telltale flush rose and mantled her brown cheeks. It always did when he looked at her. "Take this letter to General Van Sickle," he began on this occasion quite helpfully, and in a few minutes she had recovered. She could not be near Cowperwood for long at a time, however, without being stirred by a feeling which was not of her own willing. He fascinated and suffused her with a dull fire. She sometimes wondered whether a man so remarkable would ever be interested in a girl like her. The end of this essential interest, of course, was the eventual assumption of Antoinette. One might go through all the dissolving details of days in which she sat taking dictation, receiving instructions, going about her office duties in a state of apparently chill, practical, commercial single-mindedness, but it would be to no purpose. As a matter of fact, without in any way affecting the preciseness and accuracy of her labor, Her thoughts were always upon the man in the inner office, the strange master who was then seeing his men, and in between, so it seemed, a whole world of individuals, solemn and commercial, who came, presented their cards, talked at times almost interminably, and went away. It was the rare individual, however, she observed, who had the long conversation with Cowperwood, and that interested her the more. His instructions to her were always of the briefest, and he depended on her native intelligence to supply much that he scarcely more than suggested. "You understand, do you?" was his customary phrase. "Yes," she would reply. She felt as though she were 50 times as significant here as she had ever been in her life before. The office was clean, hard, bright, like Cowperwood himself. The morning sun, streaming in through an almost solid glass east front, shaded by pale green roller curtains, came to have an almost romantic atmosphere for her. Cowperwood's private office, as in Philadelphia, was a solid cherry-wood box, in which he could shut himself completely, sight-proof, sound-proof. When the door was closed, it was sacrosanct. He made it a rule, sensibly, to keep his door open as much as possible, even when he was dictating, sometimes not. It was in these half-hours of dictation, the door open as a rule, for he did not care for too much privacy, that he and Miss Novak came closest. After months and months, and because he had been busy with the other woman mentioned, of whom she knew nothing, she came to enter sometimes with a sense of suffocation, sometimes of maidenly shame. It would never have occurred to her to admit frankly that she wanted Cowperwood to make love to her. It would have frightened her to have thought of herself as yielding easily, and yet there was not a detail of his personality that was not now burned in her brain. His light, thick, always smoothly parted hair, his wide, clear, inscrutable eyes, his carefully manicured hands, so full and firm, his fresh clothing of delicate, intricate patterns. How these fascinated her. He seemed always remote, except just at the moment of doing something, when, curiously enough, he seemed intensely intimate and near. One day, after many exchanges of glances in which her own always fell sharply, in the midst of a letter, he arose and closed the half-open door. She did not think so much of that, as a rule. It had happened before. But now, today, because of a studied glance he had given her, neither tender nor smiling, she felt as though something unusual were about to happen. Her own body was going hot and cold by turns, her neck and hands. She had a fine figure, finer than she realized, with shapely limbs and torso. Her head had some of the sharpness of the old Greek coinage, and her hair was plaited as in ancient cut stone. Cowperwood noted it. He came back, and without taking his seat, bent over her, and intimately took her hand. "Antoinette," he said, lifting her gently. She looked up, then arose, for he slowly drew her, breathless, the colour gone, much of the capable practicality that was hers completely eliminated. She felt limp, inert. She pulled at her hand faintly, and then, lifting her eyes, was fixed by that hard, insatiable gaze of his. Her head swam. Her eyes were filled with a telltale confusion. "Antoinette." "Yes," she murmured. "You love me, don't you?" She tried to pull herself together, to inject some of her native rigidity of soul into her air, that rigidity which she always imagined would never desert her. But it was gone. There came instead to her a picture of the far Blue Island Avenue neighborhood from which she emanated, its low brown cottages, and then this smart, hard office, and this strong man. He came out of such a marvelous world, apparently. A strange foaming seemed to be in her blood. She was deliriously, deliciously numb and happy. "Antoinette." "Oh, I don't know what to think," she gasped. "Oh, yes, I do. "I like your name," he said simply. "Antoinette." And then, pulling her to him, he slipped his arm about her waist. She was frightened, numb, and then suddenly, not so much from shame as shock, tears rushed to her eyes. She turned and put her hand on the desk, and hung her head and sobbed. "Why, Antoinette," he asked gently, bending over her, Are you so much unused to the world? I thought you said you loved me. Do you want me to forget all this and go on as before? I can, of course, if you can, you know." He knew that she loved him, wanted him. She heard him plainly enough, shaking. "Do you?" he said, after a time, giving her moments in which to recover. "Oh, let me cry," she recovered herself sufficiently to say, quite wildly. "I don't know why I'm crying. It's just because I'm nervous, I suppose. Please don't mind me now." "Antoinette," he repeated, "look at me. Will you stop?" "Oh, no, not now. My eyes are so bad." "Antoinette. Come, look." He put his hand under her chin. "See, I'm not so terrible." "Oh," she said, when her eyes met his again. And then she folded her arms against his breast, while he petted her hand and held her close. "I'm not so bad, Antoinette. It's you as much as it is me. Do you love me, then?" "Yes, yes, oh, yes." "And you don't mind?" "No. It's all so strange." Her face was hidden. "Kiss me, then." She put up her lips and slipped her arms about him. He held her close. He tried teasingly to make her say why she cried, thinking the while of what Aileen or Rita would think if they knew. But she would not at first, admitting later that it was a sense of evil. Curiously, she also thought of Aileen, and how, on occasion, she had seen her sweep in and out. Now she was sharing with her, the dashing Mrs. Cowperwood, so vain and superior, the wonder of his affection. Strange as it may seem, she looked on it now as rather an honor. She had risen in her own estimation, her sense of life and power. Now, more than ever before, she knew something of life, because she knew something of love and passion. The future seemed tremulous with promise. She went back to her machine after a while, thinking of this. What would it all come to, she wondered wildly. You could not have told by her eyes that she had been crying. Instead, a rich glow in her brown cheeks heightened her beauty. No disturbing sense of Aileen was involved with all this. Antoinette was of the newer order that was beginning to privately question ethics and morals. She had a right to her life, lead where it would, and to what it would bring her. The feel of Cowperwood's lips was still fresh on hers. What would the future reveal to her now? What? Chapter 17. An Overture to Conflict. The result of this understanding was not so important to Cowperwood as it was to Antoinette. In a vagrant mood he had unlocked a spirit here which was fiery, passionate, but in his case hopelessly worshipful. However much she might be grieved by him, Antoinette, as he subsequently learned, would never sin against his personal welfare. Yet she was unwittingly the means of first opening the floodgates of suspicion on Aileen, thereby establishing in the latter's mind the fact of Cowperwood's persistent unfaithfulness. The incidents which led up to this were comparatively trivial, nothing more indeed at first than the sight of Miss Novak and Cowperwood talking intimately in his office one afternoon when the others had gone, and the fact that she appeared to be a little bit disturbed by Aileen's arrival. Later came the discovery, though of this Aileen could not be absolutely sure, of Cowperwood and Antoinette in a closed carriage one stormy November afternoon in State Street, when he was supposed to be out of the city. She was coming out of Merrill's store at the time, and just happened to glance at the passing vehicle which was running near the curb. Aileen, although uncertain, was greatly shocked. Could it be possible that he had not left town? She journeyed to his office on the pretext of taking old Laughlin's dog, Jenny, a pretty collar she had found, actually to find if Antoinette were away at the same time. Could it be possible, she kept asking herself, that Cowperwood had become interested in his own stenographer? The fact that the office assumed he was out of town and that Antoinette was not there gave her a pause. Laughlin quite innocently informed her that he thought Miss Novak had gone to one of the libraries to make up certain reports. It left her in doubt. What was Aileen to think? Her moods and aspirations were linked so closely with the love and success of Cowperwood that she could not, in spite of herself, but take fire at the least thought of losing him. He himself wondered sometimes, as he threaded the mesh-like paths of sex, what she would do once she discovered his variant conduct. Indeed, there had been little occasional squabbles, not sharp, but suggestive, when he was trifling about with Mrs. Kittredge, Mrs. Ledwell, and others. There were, as may be imagined, from time to time absences, brief and unimportant, which he explained easily, passional indifferences which were not explained so easily, and the like. But since his affections were not really involved in any of those instances, he had managed to smooth the matter over quite nicely. "Why'd you say that?" he would demand, when she suggested apropos of a trip, or a day when she had not been with him, that there might have been another. "You know there hasn't. If I'm going in for that sort of thing, you'll learn it fast enough. Even if I did, it wouldn't mean that I was unfaithful to you spiritually." "Oh, wouldn't it?" exclaimed Aileen resentfully, and with some disturbance of spirit. "Well, you can keep your spiritual faithfulness. I'm not going to be content with any sweet thoughts." Cowperwood laughed even as she laughed, for he knew she was right, and he felt sorry for her. At the same time, her biting humor pleased him. He knew that she did not really suspect him of actual infidelity. He was obviously so fond of her. But she also knew that he was innately attractive to women, and that there were enough of the philandering type to want to lead him astray and make her life a burden. Also that he might prove a very willing victim. Sex desire, and its fruition being such an integral factor in the marriage and every other sex relation, the average woman is prone to study the periodic manifestations that go with it, quite as one dependent on the weather, a sailor, for example, might study a barometer. In this, Aileen was no exception. She was so beautiful herself, and had been so much to Cowperwood physically, that she had followed the corresponding evidences of feeling in him with the utmost interest, accepting the recurring ebullitions of his physical emotions as an evidence of her own enduring charm. As time went on, however, and that was long before Mrs. Solberg or anyone else had appeared, the original flare of passion had undergone a form of subsidence, though not noticeable enough to be disturbing. Aileen thought and thought, but she did not investigate. Indeed, because of the precariousness of her own situation as a social failure, she was afraid to do so. With the arrival of Mrs. Solberg, and then of Antoinette Novak as factors in the potpourri, the situation became more difficult. Humanly fond of Aileen as Cowperwood was, and because of his lapses and her affection desirous of being kind, yet for the time being he was alienated almost completely from her. He grew remote according as his clandestine affairs were drifting or blazing, without, however, losing his firm grip on his financial affairs, and Aileen noticed it. It worried her. She was so vain that she could scarcely believe that Cowperwood could long be indifferent, and for a while her sentimental interest in Solberg's future and unhappiness of soul beclouded her judgment. But she finally began to feel the drift of affairs. The pathos of all this is that it so quickly descends into the realm of the unsatisfactory, the banal, the pseudo-intimate. Aileen noticed it at once. She tried protestations. "You don't kiss me the way you did once." And then a little later, "You haven't noticed me hardly for 4 whole days. What's the matter?" "Oh, I don't know," replied Cowperwood easily. "I guess I want you as much as ever. I don't see that I'm any different." He took her in his arms and petted and caressed her, but Aileen was suspicious, nervous. The psychology of the human animal when confronted by these tangles, these ripping tides of the heart, has little to do with so-called reason or logic. It is amazing how, in the face of passion and the affections and the changing face of life, all plans and theories by which we guide ourselves fall to the ground. Here was Aileen talking bravely at the time she invaded Mrs. Lillian Cowperwood's domain of the necessity of her Frank finding a woman suitable to his needs, tastes, abilities. But now that the possibility of another woman, equally or possibly better suited to him, was looming in the offing, although she had no idea who it might be, she could not reason in the same way. Her ox, God wot, was the one that was being gored. What if he should find someone whom he could want more than he did her? Dear heaven, how terrible that would be! What would she do? She asked herself thoughtfully. She lapsed into the blues one afternoon, almost cried. She could scarcely say why. Another time she thought of all the terrible things she would do, how difficult she would make it for any other woman who invaded her preserves. However, she was not sure. Would she declare war if she discovered another? She knew she would eventually, and yet she knew too that if she did and Cowperwood were set in his passion, thoroughly alienated, it would do no good. It would be terrible, but what could she do to win him back? That was the issue. Once warned, however, by her suspicious questioning, Cowperwood was more mechanically attentive than ever. He did his best to conceal his altered mood, his enthusiasms for Mrs. Solberg, his interest in Antoinette Novak, and this helped somewhat. But finally there was a detectable change. Aileen noted it first after they had been back from Europe nearly a year. At this time she was still interested in Solberg, but in a harmlessly flirtatious way. She thought he might be interesting, physically, but would he be as delightful as Cowperwood? Never. When she felt that Cowperwood himself might be changing, she pulled herself up at once, and when Antoinette appeared, the carriage incident, Solberg lost his, at best, unstable charm. She began to meditate on what a terrible thing it would be to lose Cowperwood, seeing that she had failed to establish herself socially. Perhaps that had something to do with his defection. No doubt it had. Yet she could not believe, after all his protestations of affection in Philadelphia, after all her devotion to him in those dark days of his degradation and punishment, that he would really turn on her. No, he might stray momentarily, but if she protested enough, made a scene, perhaps, he would not feel so free to injure her. He would remember and be loving and devoted again. After seeing him, or imagining she had seen him in the carriage, she thought at first that she would question him, but later decided that she would wait and watch more closely. Perhaps he was beginning to run around with other women. There was safety in numbers, that she knew. Her heart, her pride, was hurt, but not broken. Chapter 18. The Clash. The peculiar personality of Rita Solberg was such that by her very action she ordinarily allayed suspicion, or rather distracted it. Although a novice, she had a strange ease, courage, or balance of soul, which kept her whole and self-possessed under the most trying of circumstances. She might have been overtaken in the most compromising of positions, but her manner would always have indicated ease, a sense of innocence, nothing unusual, for she had no sense of moral degradation in this matter, no troublesome emotion as to what was to flow from a relationship of this kind, no worry as to her own soul, sin, social opinion, or the like. She was really interested in art and life. A pagan, in fact. Some people are thus hardily equipped. It is the most notable attribute of the hardier type of personalities, not necessarily the most brilliant or successful. You might have said that her soul was naively unconscious of the agony of others in loss. She would have taken any loss to herself with an amazing equableness. Some qualms, of course, but not many, because her vanity and sense of charm would have made her look forward to something better or as good. She had called on Aileen quite regularly in the past, with or without Harold, and had frequently driven with the Cowperwoods or joined them at the theatre or elsewhere. She had decided, after becoming intimate with Cowperwood, to study art again, which was a charming blind, for it called for attendance at afternoon or evening classes, which she frequently skipped. Besides, since Harold had more money, he was becoming gayer, more reckless and enthusiastic over women, and Cowperwood deliberately advised her to encourage him in some liaison, which, in case exposure should subsequently come to them, would effectively tie his hands. "Let him get in some affair," Cowperwood told Rita. "We'll put detectives on his trail and get evidence. He won't have a word to say." "We don't really need to do that," she protested sweetly, naively. "He's been in enough scrapes as it is. He's given me some of the letters." She pronounced it letters. "Written him." "But we'll need actual witnesses if we ever need anything at all. Just tell me when he's in love again and I'll do the rest." "You know, I think," she drawled amusingly, "that he is now. I saw him on the street the other day with one of his students. Rather a pretty girl, too." Cowperwood was pleased. Under the circumstances, he would almost have been willing, not quite, for Aileen to succumb to Solberg in order to entrap her and make his situation secure. Yet he really did not wish it in the last analysis. Would have been grieved temporarily if she had deserted him. However, in the case of Solberg, detectives were employed. The new affair with the flighty pupil was unearthed and sworn to by witnesses, and this, combined with the letters held by Rita, constituted ample material wherewith to hush up the musician if ever he became unduly obstreperous. So Cowperwood and Rita's state was quite comfortable. But Aileen, meditating over Antoinette Novak, was beside herself with curiosity, doubt, worry. She did not want to injure Cowperwood in any way after his bitter Philadelphia experience, and yet, when she thought of his deserting her in this way, she fell into a great rage. Her vanity, as much as her love, was hurt. What could she do to justify or set at rest her suspicions? Watch him personally? She was too dignified and vain to lurk about street corners or offices or hotels. Never. Start a quarrel without additional evidence? That would be silly. He was too shrewd to give her further evidence once she spoke. He would merely deny it. She brooded irritably, recalling after a time, and with an aching heart, that her father had put detectives on her track once 10 years before, and had actually discovered her relations with Cowperwood and their rendezvous. Bitter as that memory was, torturing, yet now the same means seemed not too abhorrent to employ under the circumstances. No harm had come to Cowperwood in the former instance, she reasoned to herself. No especial harm from that discovery. This was not true. And none would come to him now. This also was not true. But one must forgive a fiery, passionate soul, wounded to the quick, some errors of judgment. Her thought was that she would first be sure just what it was her beloved was doing, and then decide what course to take. But she knew that she was treading on dangerous ground, and mentally she recoiled from the consequences which might follow. He might leave her if she fought him too bitterly. He might treat her as he had treated his first wife, Lillian. She studied her liege lord curiously these days, wondering if it were true that he had deserted her already, as he had deserted his first wife 13 years before, wondering if he could really take up with a girl as common as Antoinette Novak, wondering, half afraid and yet courageous. What could be done with him? If only he still loved her, all would be well yet. But, oh... The detective agency to which she finally applied, after weeks of soul-wrecking suspense, was one of those disturbingly human implements which many are not opposed to using on occasion, when it is the only means of solving a troublous problem of wounded feelings or jeopardized interests. Aileen, being obviously rich, was, forthwith, shamefully overcharged, but the services agreed upon were well performed. To her amazement, chagrin, and distress, after a few weeks of observation, Cowperwood was reported to have affairs not only with Antoinette Novak, whom she did suspect, but also with Mrs. Solberg, and these two affairs at one and the same time. For the moment it left Aileen actually stunned and breathless. The significance of Rita Solberg to her in this hour was greater than that of any woman before or after. Of all living things, women dread women most of all, and of all women, the clever and beautiful. Rita Solberg had been growing on Aileen as a personage, for she had obviously been prospering during this past year, and her beauty had been amazingly enhanced thereby. Once Aileen had encountered Rita in a light trap on the avenue, very handsome and very new, and she had commented on it to Cowperwood, whose reply had been, "Her father must be making some money. Solberg could never earn it for her." Aileen sympathized with Harold because of his temperament, but she knew that what Cowperwood said was true. Another time, at a box party at the theatre, she had noted a rich elaborateness of Mrs. Solberg's dainty frock, the endless pleatings of pale silk, the startling charm of the needlework and the ribbons, countless, rosetted, small. That meant hard work on the part of someone. "How lovely this is," she had commented. "Yes," Rita had replied airily. "I thought, don't you know, my dressmaker would never get done working on it." It had cost, all told, $220, and Cowperwood had gladly paid the bill. Aileen went home at the time thinking of Rita's taste and of how well she had harmonized her materials to her personality. She was truly charming. Now, however, when it appeared that the same charm that had appealed to her had appealed to Cowperwood, she conceived an angry animal opposition to it all. Rita Solberg. Huh! A lot of satisfaction she'd get knowing, as she would soon, that Cowperwood was sharing his affection for her with Antoinette Novak, a mere stenographer. And a lot of satisfaction Antoinette would get, the cheap upstart, when she learned, as she would, that Cowperwood loved her so lightly that he would take an apartment for Rita Solberg, and let a cheap hotel or an assignation house do for her. But in spite of this savage exultation, her thoughts kept coming back to herself, to her own predicament, to torture and destroy her. Cowperwood the liar, Cowperwood the pretender, Cowperwood the sneak. At one moment she conceived a kind of horror of the man because of all his protestations to her. At the next, a rage, bitter, swelling. At the next, a pathetic realization of her own altered position. Say what one will, to take the love of a man like Cowperwood away from a woman like Aileen was to leave her high and dry on land, as a fish out of its native element, to take all the wind out of her sails, almost to kill her. Whatever position she had once thought to hold through him was now jeopardized. Whatever joy or glory she had had in being Mrs. Frank Algernon Cowperwood, it was now tarnished. She sat in her room, this same day after the detectives had given their report, a tired look in her eyes, the first set lines her pretty mouth had ever known showing about it, her past and her future whirling painfully and nebulously in her brain. Suddenly she got up, and seeing Cowperwood's picture on her dresser, his still, impressive eyes, contemplating her, she seized it and threw it on the floor, stamping on his handsome face with her pretty foot, and raging at him in her heart. The dog! The brute! Her brain was full of the thought of Rita's white arms about him, of his lips to hers. The spectacle of Rita's fluffy gowns, her enticing costumes, was in her eyes. Rita should not have him. She should not have anything connected with him, nor for that matter Antoinette Novak either, the wretched upstart, the hireling. To think he should stoop to an office stenographer. Once on that thought she decided that he should not be allowed to have a woman as an assistant any more. He owed it to her to love her after all she had done for him, the coward, and to let other women alone. Her brain whirled with strange thoughts. She was really not sane in her present state. She was so wrought up by her prospective loss that she could only think of rash, impossible, destructive things to do. She dressed swiftly, feverishly, and calling a closed carriage from the coach-house, ordered herself to be driven to the New Arts Building. She would show this rosy cat of a woman, this smiling piece of impertinence, this she-devil, whether she would lure Cowperwood away. She meditated as she rode. She would not sit back and be robbed as Mrs. Cowperwood had been by her. Never. He could not treat her that way. She would die first. She would kill Rita Solberg, and Antoinette Novak, and Cowperwood, and herself first. She would prefer to die that way rather than lose his love. Oh yes, 1,000 times. Fortunately, Rita Solberg was not at the New Arts Building, or Solberg either. They had gone to a reception. Nor was she at the apartment on the north side where, under the name of Jacobs, as Aileen had been informed by the detectives, she and Cowperwood kept occasional tryst. Aileen hesitated for a moment, feeling it useless to wait. Then she ordered the coachman to drive to her husband's office. It was now nearly 5 o'clock. Antoinette and Cowperwood had both gone, but she did not know it. She changed her mind, however, before she reached the office, for it was Rita Solberg she wished to reach first, and ordered the coachman to drive back to the Solberg studio. But still they had not returned. In a kind of aimless rage she went home, wondering how she should reach Rita Solberg first and alone. Then, to her savage delight, the game walked into her bag. The Solbergs, returning home at 6 o'clock from some reception farther out Michigan Avenue, had stopped at the Wish of Harold, merely to pass the time of day with Mrs. Cowperwood. Rita was exquisite in a pale blue and lavender concoction, with silver braid worked in here and there. Her gloves and shoes were pungent bits of romance, her hat a dream of graceful lines. At the sight of her, Aileen, who was still in the hall and had opened the door herself, fairly burned to seize her by the throat and strike her. But she restrained herself sufficiently to say, "Come in." She still had sense enough and self-possession enough to conceal her wrath and to close the door. Beside his wife, Harold was standing, offensively smug and inefficient in the fashionable frock-coat and silk hat of the time, a restraining influence as yet. He was bowing and smiling. "Oh." This sound was neither an O nor an ah, but a kind of Danish inflected "aw," which was usually not unpleasing to hear. "How are you once more, Mrs. Cowperwood? It is such a pleasure to see you again. Oh." "Won't you two just go in the reception-room a moment?" said Aileen, almost hoarsely. "I'll be right in. I want to get something." Then, as an afterthought, she called very sweetly, "Oh, Mrs. Solberg, won't you come up to my room for a moment? I have something I want to show you." Rita responded promptly. She always felt it incumbent upon her to be very nice to Aileen. "We have only a moment to stay," she replied archly and sweetly, and coming out in the hall, "but I'll come up." Aileen stayed to see her go first, then followed upstairs, swiftly, surely, entered after Rita and closed the door. With a courage and rage born of a purely animal despair, she turned and locked it. Then she wheeled swiftly, her eyes lit with a savage fire, her cheeks pale, but later aflame, her hands, her fingers working in a strange, unconscious way. "So," she said, looking at Rita and coming toward her quickly and angrily, "you'll steal my husband, will you? You'll live in a secret apartment, will you? You'll come here smiling and lying to me, will you? You beast! You cat! You prostitute! I'll show you now, you tow-headed beast! I know you now for what you are. I'll teach you once and for all. Take that, and that, and that!" Suiting action to word, Aileen had descended upon her in a whirlwind, animal fashion, striking, scratching, choking, tearing her visitor's hat from her head, ripping the laces from her neck, beating her in the face and clutching violently at her hair and throat to choke and mar her beauty if she could. For the moment, she was really crazy with rage. By the suddenness of this onslaught, Rita Solberg was taken back completely. It all came so swiftly, so terribly, she scarcely realized what was happening before the storm was upon her. There was no time for arguments, pleas, anything. Terrified, shamed, nonplussed, she went down quite limply under this almost lightning attack. When Aileen began to strike her, she attempted in vain to defend herself, uttering at the same time piercing screams which could be heard throughout the house. She screamed shrilly, strangely, like a wild, dying animal. On the instant, all her fine, civilized poise had deserted her. From the sweetness and delicacy of the reception atmosphere, the polite cooings, posturings, and mouthings, so charming to contemplate, so alluring in her, she had dropped on the instant to that native animal condition that shows itself in fear. Her eyes had a look of hunted horror, her lips and cheeks were pale and drawn. She retreated in a staggering, ungraceful way, she writhed and squirmed, screaming in the strong clutch of the irate and vigorous Aileen. Cowperwood entered the hall below just before the screams began. He had followed the Solbergs almost immediately from his office, and chancing to glance in the reception-room, he had observed Solberg, smiling, radiant, an intangible air of self-ingratiating, social and artistic sycophancy about him, his long black frock coat buttoned smoothly around his body, his silk hat still in his hands. "Ah, how do you do, Mr. Cowperwood?" he was beginning to say, his curly head shaking in a friendly manner. "I'm so glad to see you again." But who can imitate a scream of terror? We have no words, no symbols even for those essential sounds of fright and agony. They filled the hall, the library, the reception-room, the distant kitchen even, and basement with a kind of vibrant terror. Cowperwood, always the man of action as opposed to nervous cogitation, braced up on the instant like taut wire. What, for heaven's sake, could that be? What a terrible cry! Solberg the artist, responding like a chameleon to the various emotional complexions of life, began to breathe stertorously, to blanch, to lose control of himself. "My God!" he exclaimed, throwing up his hands. "That's Rita! She's upstairs in your wife's room. Something must have happened. Oh!" On the instant he was quite beside himself, terrified, shaking, almost useless. Cowperwood, on the contrary, without a moment's hesitation, had thrown his coat to the floor, dashed up the stairs, followed by Solberg. What could it be? Where was Aileen? As he bounded upward, a clear sense of something untoward came over him. It was sickening, terrifying. Scream, scream, scream came the sounds. "Oh my God, don't kill me! Help! Help!" Scream! This last a long, terrified, ear-piercing wail. Solberg was about to drop from heart failure, he was so frightened. His face was an ashen grey. Cowperwood seized the doorknob vigorously, and finding the door locked, shook, rattled, and banged at it. "Aileen!" he called sharply. "Aileen! What's the matter in there? Open this door, Aileen!" "Oh, my God! Oh, help! Help! Oh, mercy! Oh!" It was the moaning voice of Rita. "I'll show you, you she-devil!" he heard Aileen calling. "I'll teach you, you beast! You cat! You prostitute! There! There! There!" "Aileen!" he called hoarsely. "Aileen!" Then, getting no response, and the screams continuing, he turned angrily. "Stand back," he exclaimed to Solberg, who was moaning helplessly. "Get me a chair, get me a table, anything." The butler ran to obey, but before he could return, Cowperwood had found an implement. "Here," he said, seizing a long, thin, heavily carved and heavily wrought oak chair, which stood at the head of the stairs on the landing. He whirled it vigorously over his head. Smash! The sound rose louder than the screams inside. Smash! The chair creaked and almost broke, but the door did not give. Smash! The chair broke and the door flew open. He had knocked the lock loose and had leaped in to where Aileen, kneeling over Rita on the floor, was choking and beating her into insensibility. Like an animal he was upon her. "Aileen!" he shouted fiercely, in a hoarse, ugly, guttural voice. "You fool! You idiot! Let go! What the devil's the matter with you? What are you trying to do? Have you lost your mind, you crazy idiot?" He seized her strong hands and ripped them apart. He fairly dragged her back, half twisting and half throwing her over his knee, loosing her clutching hold. She was so insanely furious that she still struggled and cried, saying, "Let me at her! Let me at her! I'll teach her! Don't you try to hold me, you dog! I'll show you, too, you brute! Oh!" "Pick up that woman," called Cowperwood firmly to Solberg and the butler who had entered. "Get her out of here, quick. My wife has gone crazy. Get her out of here, I tell you. This woman doesn't know what she's doing. Take her out and get a doctor. What sort of a hell's melee is this, anyway?" "Oh," moaned Rita, who was torn and fainting, almost unconscious from sheer terror. "I'll kill her!" screamed Aileen. "I'll murder her! I'll murder you, too, you dog! Oh!" She began striking at him. "I'll teach you to run around with other women, you dog, you brute!" Cowperwood merely gripped her hands and shook her vigorously, forcefully. "What the devil has got into you anyway, you fool?" he said to her bitterly as they carried Rita out. "What are you trying to do anyway, murder her? Do you want the police to come here? Stop your screaming and behave yourself, or I'll shove a handkerchief in your mouth. Stop, I tell you, stop! Do you hear me? This is enough, you fool!" He clapped his hand over her mouth, pressing it tight and forcing her back against him. He shook her brutally, angrily. He was very strong. "Now, will you stop?" he insisted. "Or do you want me to choke you quiet? I will if you don't. You're out of your mind. Stop, I tell you. So this is the way you carry on when things don't go to suit you." She was sobbing, struggling, moaning, half screaming, quite beside herself. "Oh, you crazy fool," he said, swinging her round, and with an effort getting out a handkerchief, which he forced over her face and in her mouth. "There," he said, relievedly. "Now will you shut up?" Holding her tight in an iron grip, he let her struggle and turn, quite ready to put an end to her breathing if necessary. Now that he had conquered her, he continued to hold her tightly, stooping beside her on one knee, listening and meditating. Hers was surely a terrible passion. From some points of view he could not blame her. Great was her provocation, great her love. He knew her disposition well enough to have anticipated something of this sort. Yet the wretchedness, shame, scandal of the terrible affair upset his customary equilibrium. To think anyone should give way to such a storm as this. To think that Aileen should do it. To think that Rita should have been so mistreated. It was not at all unlikely that she was seriously injured, marred for life, possibly even killed. The horror of that. The ensuing storm of public rage. A trial. His whole career gone up in one terrific explosion of woe, anger, death. Great God! He called the butler to him with a nod of his head when the latter, who had gone out with Rita, hurried back. "How is she?" he asked desperately. "Seriously hurt?" "No, sir, I think not. I believe she's just fainted. She'll be all right in a little while, sir. Can I be of any service, sir?" Ordinarily, Cowperwood would have smiled at such a scene. Now he was cold sober. "Not now," he replied with a sigh of relief, still holding Aileen firmly. "Go out and close the door. Call a doctor. Wait in the hall. When he comes, call me." Aileen, conscious of things being done for Rita, of sympathy being extended to her, tried to get up, to scream again, but she couldn't. Her lord and master held her in an ugly hold. When the door was closed, he said again, "Now, Aileen, will you hush? Will you let me get up and talk to you, or must we stay here all night? Do you want me to drop you forever after tonight? I understand all about this, but I'm in control now, and I'm going to stay so. You will come to your senses and be reasonable, or I will leave you tomorrow, as sure as I am here." His voice rang convincingly. "Now, shall we talk sensibly? Or will you go on making a fool of yourself, disgracing me, disgracing the house, making yourself and myself the laughing-stock of the servants, the neighborhood, the city? This is a fine showing you've made today, good God! A fine showing indeed. A brawl in this house, a fight. I thought you had better sense, more self-respect. Really I did. You have seriously jeopardized my chances here in Chicago. You have seriously injured and possibly killed a woman. You could even be hanged for that. Do you hear me?" "Oh, let them hang me," groaned Aileen. "I want to die." He took away his hand from her mouth, loosened his grip upon her arms, and let her get to her feet. She was still torrential, impetuous, ready to upbraid him, but once standing she was confronted by him, cold, commanding, fixing her with a fishy eye. He wore a look now she had never seen on his face before, a hard, wintry, dynamic flare, which no one but his commercial enemies, and only those occasionally, had seen. "Now stop," he exclaimed. "Not one more word, not one. Do you hear me?" She wavered, quailed, gave way. All the fury of her tempestuous soul fell, as the sea falls under a lapse of wind. She had it in her heart, on her lips, to cry again, "You dog, you brute," and 100 other terrible, useless things. But somehow, under the pressure of his gaze, the hardness of his heart, the words on her lips died away. She looked at him uncertainly for a moment, then, turning, she threw herself on the bed near by, clutched her cheeks and mouth and eyes, and rocking back and forth in an agony of woe, she began to sob. "Oh, my God, my heart, my life, I want to die, I want to die." Standing there watching her, there suddenly came to Cowperwood a keen sense of her soul hurt, her heart hurt, and he was moved. "Aileen," he said after a moment or two, coming over and touching her quite gently. "Aileen, don't cry so. I haven't left you yet. Your life isn't utterly ruined. Don't cry. This is bad business, but perhaps it is not without remedy. Come now, pull yourself together, Aileen." For answer she merely rocked and moaned, uncontrolled and uncontrollable. Being anxious about conditions elsewhere, he turned and stepped out into the hall. He must make some show for the benefit of the doctor and the servants. He must look after Rita, and offer some sort of passing explanation to Solberg. "Here," he called to a passing servant, "shut that door and watch it. If Mrs. Cowperwood comes out, call me instantly." Chapter 19. Hell Hath No Fury. Rita was not dead by any means, only seriously bruised, scratched, and choked. Her scalp was cut in one place. Aileen had repeatedly beaten her head on the floor, and this might have resulted seriously if Cowperwood had not entered as quickly as he had. Solberg, for the moment, for some little time in fact, was under the impression that Aileen had truly lost her mind, had suddenly gone crazy, and that those shameless charges he had heard her making were the emanations of a disordered brain. Nevertheless, the things she had said haunted him. He was in a bad state himself, almost a subject for the doctor. His lips were bluish, his cheeks blanched. Rita had been carried into an adjoining bedroom and laid upon a bed. Cold water, ointments, a bottle of arnica had been procured, and when Cowperwood appeared she was conscious and somewhat better. But she was still very weak and smarting from her wounds, both mental and physical. When the doctor arrived, he had been told that a lady, a guest, had fallen downstairs. When Cowperwood came in, the physician was dressing her wounds. As soon as he had gone, Cowperwood said to the maid in attendance, "Go get me some hot water." As the latter disappeared, he bent over and kissed Rita's bruised lips, putting his fingers to his own in warning sign. "Rita," he asked softly, "are you fully conscious?" She nodded weakly. "Listen, then," he said, bending over and speaking slowly. "Listen carefully. Pay strict attention to what I'm saying. You must understand every word and do as I tell you. You are not seriously injured. You will be all right. This will blow over. I've sent for another doctor to call on you at your studio. Your husband has gone for some fresh clothes. He will come back in a little while. My carriage will take you home when you are a little stronger. You mustn't worry. Everything will be all right, but you must deny everything, do you hear? Everything. Insofar as you know, Mrs. Cowperwood is insane. I will talk to your husband tomorrow. I will send you a trained nurse. Meantime, you must be careful of what you say and how you say it. Be perfectly calm. Don't worry. You're perfectly safe here, and you will be there. Mrs. Cowperwood will not trouble you any more. I will see to that. I'm so sorry. But I love you. I'm near you all the while. You must not let this make any difference. You will not see her any more." Still, he knew that it would make a difference. Reassured as to Rita's condition, he went back to Aileen's room to plead with her again, to soothe her if he could. He found her up and dressing, a new thought and determination in her mind. Since she had thrown herself on the bed, sobbing and groaning, her mood had gradually changed. She began to reason that if she could not dominate him, could not make him properly sorry, she had better leave. It was evident, she thought, that he did not love her any more, seeing that his anxiety to protect Rita had been so great, his brutality in restraining her so marked. And yet she did not want to believe that this was so. He had been so wonderful to her in times past. She had not given up all hope of winning a victory over him, and these other women. She loved him too much, but only a separation would do it. That might bring him to his senses. She would get up, dress, and go downtown to a hotel. He would not see her any more unless he followed her. She was satisfied that she had broken up the liaison with Rita Solberg, anyway for the present, and as for Antoinette Novak, she would attend to her later. Her brain and her heart ached. She was so full of woe and rage alternating that she could not cry any more now. She stood before her mirror, trying with trembling fingers to do over her toilet and adjust a street costume. Cowperwood was disturbed, nonplussed at this unexpected sight. "Aileen," he said, finally coming up behind her, "can't you and I talk this thing over peacefully now? You don't want to do anything that you'll be sorry for. I don't want you to. I'm sorry. You don't really believe that I've ceased to love you, do you? I haven't, you know. This thing isn't as bad as it looks. I should think you would have a little more sympathy with me after all we've been through together. You haven't any real evidence of wrongdoing on which to base any such outburst as this." "Oh, haven't I?" she exclaimed, turning from the mirror, where sorrowfully and bitterly she was smoothing her red gold hair. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes red. Just now she seemed as remarkable to him as she had seemed that first day, years ago, when in a red cape he had seen her, a girl of 16, running up the steps of her father's house in Philadelphia. She was so wonderful then. It mellowed his mood toward her. "That's all you know about it, you liar," she declared. "It's little you know what I know. I haven't had detectives on your trail for weeks for nothing, you sneak. You'd like to smooth around now and find out what I know. Well, I know enough. Let me tell you that. You won't fool me any longer with your Rita Solbergs and your Antoinette Novaks, and your apartments and your houses of assignation. I know what you are, you brute. And after all your protestations of love for me, ugh!" She turned fiercely to her task, while Cowperwood stared at her, touched by her passion, moved by her force. It was fine to see what a dramatic animal she was, really worthy of him in many ways. "Aileen," he said softly, hoping still to ingratiate himself by degrees. "Please don't be so bitter toward me. Haven't you any understanding of how life works? Any sympathy with it? I thought you were more generous, more tender. I'm not so bad." He eyed her thoughtfully, tenderly, hoping to move her through her love for him. "Sympathy! Sympathy!" She turned on him, blazing. "A lot you know about sympathy. I suppose I didn't give you any sympathy when you were in the penitentiary in Philadelphia, did I? A lot of good it did me, didn't it? Sympathy? Bah!"
To have you come out here to Chicago to take up with a lot of prostitutes, cheap stenographers, and wives of musicians? You have given me a lot of sympathy, haven't you? With that woman lying in the next room to prove it?"
She smoothed her lithe waist and shook her shoulders, preparatory to putting on a hat and adjusting her wrap. She proposed to go just as she was, and send Fadette back for all her belongings. "Aileen," he pleaded, determined to have his way. "I think you're very foolish, really I do. There's no occasion for all this, none in the world. Here you are, talking at the top of your voice, scandalizing the whole neighborhood, fighting, leaving the house. It's abominable. I don't want you to do it. You love me yet, don't you? You know you do. I know you don't mean all you say, you can't. You really don't believe that I have ceased to love you, do you, Aileen?"
"Love?" fired Aileen. "A lot you know about love. A lot you have ever loved anybody, you brute. I know how you love. I thought you loved me once. Humph. I see how you loved me, just as you loved 50 other women, as you love that snippy little Rita Solberg in the next room, the cat, the dirty little beast, the way you love Antoinette Novak, a cheap stenographer. Bah! You don't know what the word means."
And yet her voice trailed off into a kind of sob, and her eyes filled with tears, hot, angry, aching. Cowperwood saw them and came over, hoping in some way to take advantage of them. He was truly sorry now, anxious to make her feel tender toward him once more. "Aileen," he pleaded, "please don't be so bitter. You shouldn't be so hard on me. I'm not so bad. Aren't you going to be reasonable?" He put out a smoothing hand, but she jumped away. "Don't you touch me, you brute!" she exclaimed angrily. "Don't you lay a hand on me! I don't want you to come near me. I'll not live with you. I'll not stay in the same house with you and your mistress. Go and live with your dear, darling Rita on the north side if you want to. I don't care. I suppose you've been in the next room comforting her, the beast. I wish I had killed her. Oh, God!" She tore at her throat in a violent rage, trying to adjust a button. Cowperwood was literally astonished. Never had he seen such an outburst as this. He had not believed Aileen to be capable of it. He could not help admiring her. Nevertheless, he resented the brutality of her assault on Rita, and on his own promiscuous tendency, and this feeling vented itself in one last unfortunate remark. "I wouldn't be so hard on mistresses if I were you, Aileen," he ventured pleadingly. "I should have thought your own experience would have—" He paused, for he saw on the instant that he was making a grave mistake. This reference to her past as a mistress was crucial. On the instant she straightened up, and her eyes filled with a great pain. "So that's the way you talk to me, is it?" she asked. "I knew it. I knew it. I knew it would come." She turned to a tall chest of drawers as high as her breast, laden with silverware, jewel boxes, brushes, and combs, and putting her arms down, she laid her head upon them and began to cry. This was the last straw. He was throwing up her lawless girlhood love to her as an offense. "Oh!" she sobbed, and shook in a hopeless, wretched paroxysm. Cowperwood came over quickly. He was distressed, pained. "I didn't mean that, Aileen," he explained. "I didn't mean it in that way, not at all. You rather drew that out of me, but I didn't mean it as a reproach. You were my mistress, but good Lord, I never loved you any the less for that. Rather more. You know I did. I want you to believe that. It's true. These other matters haven't been so important to me. They really haven't." He looked at her helplessly as she moved away to avoid him. He was distressed, nonplussed, immensely sorry. As he walked to the center of the room again, she suddenly suffered a great revulsion of feeling, but only in the direction of more wrath. This was too much. "So this is the way you talk to me," she exclaimed, "after all I've done for you. You say that to me after I waited for you and cried over you when you were in prison for nearly 2 years? Your mistress. That's my reward, is it? Oh!" Suddenly she observed her jewel case, and, resenting all the gifts he had given her in Philadelphia, in Paris, in Rome, here in Chicago, she suddenly threw open the lid, and, grabbing the contents by handfuls, began to toss them toward him, to actually throw them in his face. Out they came, handfuls of gauds that he had given her in real affection, a jade necklace and bracelet of pale apple green set in spun gold, with clasps of white ivory, a necklace of pearls, assorted as to size and matched in color, that shone with a tinted, pearly flame in the evening light, a handful of rings and brooches, diamonds, rubies, opals, amethysts, a dog collar of emeralds, and a diamond hair ornament. She flung them at him excitedly, strewing the floor, striking him on the neck, the face, the hands. "Take that, and that, and that! There they are. I don't want anything more of yours. I don't want anything more to do with you. I don't want anything that belongs to you. Thank God I have money enough of my own to live on. I hate you. I despise you. I never want to see you any more. Oh!" And trying to think of something more, but failing, she dashed swiftly down the hall and down the stairs, while he stood, for just one moment, overwhelmed. Then he hurried after her. "Aileen!" he called. "Aileen, come back here! Don't go, Aileen!" But she only hurried faster. She opened and closed the door, and actually ran out in the dark, her eyes wet, her heart bursting. So this was the end of that youthful dream that had begun so beautifully. She was no better than the others, just one of his mistresses. To have her past thrown up to her as a defense for the others? To be told that she was no better than they? This was the last straw. She choked and sobbed as she walked, vowing never to return, never to see him any more. But as she did so, Cowperwood came running after, determined for once, as lawless as he was, that this should not be the end of it all. She had loved him, he reflected. She had laid every gift of passion and affection on the altar of her love. It wasn't fair, really. She must be made to stay. He caught up at last, reaching her under the dark of the November trees. "Aileen," he said, laying hold of her and putting his arms around her waist. "Aileen, dearest, this is plain madness. This is insanity. You're not in your right mind. Don't go. Don't leave me. I love you. Don't you know I do? Can't you really see that? Don't run away like this, and don't cry. I love you, and you know it. I always shall. Come back now. Kiss me. I'll do better, really I will. Give me another chance. Wait and see. Come now, won't you? That's my girl, my Aileen. Do come, please." She pulled on, but he held her, smoothing her arms, her neck, her face. "Aileen," he entreated. She tugged, so that he was finally compelled to work her about into his arms. Then, sobbing, she stood there, agonized, but happy once more in a way. "But I don't want to," she protested. "You don't love me any more. Let me go." But he kept hold of her, urging, and finally she said, her head upon his shoulder as of old, "Don't make me come back tonight. I don't want to. I can't. Let me go downtown. I'll come back later, maybe." "Then I'll go with you," he said endearingly. "It isn't right. There are a lot of things I should be doing to stop this scandal, but I'll go." And together they sought a streetcar. Chapter 20. Man and Superman. It is a sad commentary on all save the most chemic unions, those dark red flowers of romance that bloom most often only for a tragic end, that they cannot endure the storms of disaster that are wont to overtake them. A woman like Rita Solberg, with a seemingly urgent feeling for Cowperwood, was yet not so charmed by him, but that this shock to her pride was a marked sedative. The crushing weight of such an exposure as this, the Homeric laughter inherent, if not indicated, in the faulty planning, the failure to take into account beforehand all the possibilities which might lead to such a disaster, was too much for her to endure. She was stung almost to desperation, maddened at the thought of the gay, idle way in which she had walked into Mrs. Cowperwood's clutches, and been made into a spectacle and a laughing-stock by her. What a brute she was! What a demon! Her own physical weakness under the circumstances was no grief to her, rather a salve to her superior disposition. But just the same, she had been badly beaten, her beauty turned into a ragamuffin show, and that was enough. This evening, in the Lakeshore Sanitarium where she had been taken, she had but one thought, to get away when it should all be over and rest her wearied brain. She did not want to see Solberg any more. She did not want to see Cowperwood any more. Already Harold, suspicious and determined to get at the truth, was beginning to question her as to the strangeness of Aileen's attack, her probable reason. When Cowperwood was announced, Solberg's manner modified somewhat, for whatever his suspicions were, he was not prepared to quarrel with this singular man as yet. "I'm so sorry about this unfortunate business," said Cowperwood, coming in with brisk assurance. "I never knew my wife to become so strangely unbalanced before. It was most fortunate that I arrived when I did. I certainly owe you both every amend that can be made. I sincerely hope, Mrs. Solberg, that you are not seriously injured. If there is anything I can possibly do, anything either of you can suggest—" He looked around solicitously at Solberg. "I shall only be too glad to do it. How would it do for you to take Mrs. Solberg away for a little while for a rest? I shall so gladly pay all expenses in connection with her recovery." Solberg, brooding and heavy, remained unresponsive, smouldering. Rita, cheered by Cowperwood's presence, but not wholly relieved by any means, was questioning and disturbed. She was afraid there was to be a terrific scene between them. She declared she was better and would be all right, that she did not need to go away, but that she preferred to be alone. "It's very strange," said Solberg suddenly after a little while. "I don't understand it. I don't understand it at all. Why should she do such a thing? Why should she say such things? Here we have been the best of friends up to now. Then suddenly she attacks my wife and says all these strange things. But I have assured you, my dear Mr. Solberg, that my wife was not in her right mind. She has been subject to spells of this kind in the past, though never to anything so violent as this tonight. Already she has recovered her normal state, and she does not remember. But perhaps if we are going to discuss things now, we had better go out in the hall. Your wife will need all the rest she can get." Once outside, Cowperwood continued with brilliant assurance. "Now, my dear Solberg, what is it I can say? What is it you wish me to do? My wife has made a lot of groundless charges, to say nothing of injuring your wife most seriously and shamefully. I cannot tell you, as I have said, how sorry I am. I assure you Mrs. Cowperwood is suffering from a gross illusion. There is absolutely nothing to do, nothing to say, as far as I can see, but to let the whole matter drop. Don't you agree with me?" Harold was twisting mentally in the coils of a trying situation. His own position, as he knew, was not formidable. Rita had reproached him over and over for infidelity. He began to swell and bluster at once. "That is all very well for you to say, Mr. Cowperwood," he commented defiantly. "But how about me? Where do I come in? I don't know what to think yet. It is very strange. Supposing what your wife says was true. Supposing my wife has been going around with someone. That is what I want to find out, if she has. If it is what I think it is, I don't know what I shall do. I am a very violent man." Cowperwood almost smiled. Concerned as he was over avoiding publicity, he had no fear of Solberg physically. "See here," he exclaimed suddenly, looking sharply at the musician and deciding to take the bull by the horns. "You are in quite as delicate a situation as I am, if you only stop to think. This affair, if it gets out, will involve not only me and Mrs. Cowperwood, but yourself and your wife, and if I am not mistaken, I think your own affairs are not in any too good shape. You cannot blacken your wife without blackening yourself. That is inevitable. None of us is exactly perfect. For myself, I shall be compelled to prove insanity, and I can do this easily. If there is anything in your past which is not precisely what it should be, it could not long be kept a secret. If you are willing to let the matter drop, I will make handsome provision for you both. If instead you choose to make trouble, to force this matter into the daylight, I shall leave no stone unturned to protect myself, to put as good a face on this matter as I can." "What?" exclaimed Solberg. "You threaten me? You try to frighten me after your wife charges that you have been running around with my wife? You talk about my past? I like that. Ha! We shall see about this. What is it you know about me?" "Well, Mr. Solberg," rejoined Cowperwood calmly, "I know, for instance, that for a long while your wife has not loved you, that you have been living on her as any pensioner might, that you have been running around with as many as 6 or 7 women in as many years or less. For months I have been acting as your wife's financial adviser, and in that time, with the aid of detectives, I have learned of Anna Stelmark, Jessie Laska, Bertha Reese, Georgia DuCoin. Do I need to say any more? As a matter of fact, I have a number of your letters in my possession." "So, that is it," exclaimed Solberg, while Cowperwood eyed him fixedly. "You have been running around with my wife. It is true, then. A fine situation.
And you come here now with these threats, these lies to bulldoze me? Ha! We will see about them. We will see what I can do. Wait till I can consult a lawyer first. Then we will see.
Cowperwood surveyed him coldly, angrily. What an ass, he thought. See here, he said, urging Solberg for privacy's sake to come down into the lower hall, and then into the street before the sanitarium, where 2 gas lamps were fluttering fitfully in the dark and wind. I see very plainly that you are bent on making trouble. It is not enough that I have assured you that there is nothing in this, that I have given you my word. You insist on going further. Very well, then. Supposing, for argument's sake, that Mrs. Cowperwood was not insane, that every word she said was true, that I have been misconducting myself with your wife. What of it? What will you do? He looked at Solberg smoothly, ironically, while the latter flared up. Ha! He shouted melodramatically. Why, I would kill you. That's what I would do. I would kill her. I will make a terrible scene. Just let me know that this was so, and then see. Exactly, replied Cowperwood grimly. I thought so. I believe you. For that reason I have come prepared to serve you in just the way you wish. He reached in his coat and took out 2 small revolvers, which he had taken from a drawer at home for this very purpose. They gleamed in the dark. Do you see this? He continued. I'm going to save you the trouble of further investigation, Mr. Solberg. Every word that Mrs. Cowperwood said tonight, and I am saying this with a full understanding of what this means to you and to me, is true. She is no more insane than I am. Your wife has been living in an apartment with me on the north side for months, though you cannot prove that. She does not love you, but me. Now, if you want to kill me, here is a gun. He extended his hand. Take your choice. If I am to die, you might as well die with me. He said it so coolly, so firmly that Solberg, who was an innate coward, and who had no more desire to die than any other healthy animal, paled. The look of cold steel was too much. The hand that pressed them on him was hard and firm. He took hold of one, but his fingers trembled. The steely, metallic voice in his ear was undermining the little courage that he had. Cowperwood by now had taken on the proportions of a dangerous man, the lineaments of a demon. He turned away, mortally terrified. "My God!" he exclaimed, shaking like a leaf. "You want to kill me, do you? I will not have anything to do with you. I will not talk to you. I will see my lawyer. I will talk to my wife first." "Oh, no, you won't," replied Cowperwood, intercepting him as he turned to go, and seizing him firmly by the arm. "I'm not going to have you do anything of the sort. I am not going to kill you, if you are not going to kill me. But I am going to make you listen to reason for once. Now, here is what else I have to say, and then I'm through. I'm not unfriendly to you. I want to do you a good turn, little as I care for you. To begin with, there is nothing in those charges my wife made, not a thing. I merely said what I did just now to see if you were in earnest. You do not love your wife any more. She doesn't love you. You are no good to her. Now, I have a very friendly proposition to make to you. If you want to leave Chicago and stay away 3 years or more, I will see that you are paid $5,000 every year on January 1st, on the nail. $5,000. Do you hear? Or you can stay here in Chicago and hold your tongue, and I will make it $3,000, monthly or yearly, just as you please. But, and this is what I want you to remember, if you don't get out of town or hold your tongue, if you make one single rash move against me, I will kill you, and I will kill you on sight. Now I want you to go away from here and behave yourself. Leave your wife alone. Come and see me in a day or 2. The money is ready for you any time." He paused while Solberg stared, his eyes round and glassy. This was the most astonishing experience of his life. This man was either devil or prince or both. Good God, he thought. He will do that too. He will really kill me. Then the astonishing alternative, $5,000 a year, came to his mind. Well, why not? His silence gave consent. "If I were you, I wouldn't go upstairs again tonight," continued Cowperwood sternly. "Don't disturb her. She needs rest. Go on downtown and come and see me tomorrow. Or if you want to go back, I will go with you. I want to say to Mrs. Solberg what I have said to you, but remember what I've told you." "No, thank you," replied Solberg feebly. "I will go downtown. Good night." And he hurried away. "I'm sorry," said Cowperwood to himself defensively. "It is too bad, but it was the only way." Chapter 21. A Matter of Tunnels. The question of Solberg adjusted thus simply, if brutally, Cowperwood turned his attention to Mrs. Solberg, but there was nothing much to be done. He explained that he had now completely subdued Aileen and Solberg, that the latter would make no more trouble, that he was going to pension him, that Aileen would remain permanently quiescent. He expressed the greatest solicitude for her, but Rita was now sickened of this tangle. She had loved him, as she thought, but through the rage of Aileen she saw him in a different light, and she wanted to get away. His money, plentiful as it was, did not mean as much to her as it might have meant to some women. It simply spelled luxuries, without which she could exist if she must. His charm for her had perhaps consisted mostly in the atmosphere of flawless security which seemed to surround him, a glittering bubble of romance. That, by one fell attack, was now burst. He was seen to be quite as other men, subject to the same storms, the same danger of shipwreck, only he was a better sailor than most. She recuperated gradually, left for home, left for Europe. Details too long to be narrated. Solberg, after much meditating and fuming, finally accepted the offer of Cowperwood and returned to Denmark. Aileen, after a few days of quarrelling in which he agreed to dispense with Antoinette Novak, returned home. Cowperwood was in no wise pleased by this rough denouement. Aileen had not raised her own attractions in his estimation, and yet, strange to relate, he was not unsympathetic with her. He had no desire to desert her as yet, though for some time he had been growing in the feeling that Rita would have been a much better type of wife for him. But what he could not have, he could not have. He turned his attention with renewed force to his business. But it was with many a backward glance at those radiant hours when, with Rita in his presence or enfolded by his arms, he had seen life from a new and poetic angle. She was so charming, so naive. But what could he do? For several years thereafter, Cowperwood was busy following the Chicago Street Railway situation with increasing interest. He knew it was useless to brood over Rita Solberg. She would not return, and yet he could not help it. But he could work hard, and that was something. His natural aptitude and affection for street railway work had long since been demonstrated, and it was now making him restless. One might have said of him, quite truly, that the tinkle of car bells and the plop of plodding horses' feet was in his blood. He surveyed these extending lines with their jingling cars as he went about the city with an almost hungry eye. Chicago was growing fast, and these little horse cars on certain streets were crowded, night and morning, fairly bulging with people at the rush hours. If he could only secure an octopus grip on one or all of them, if he could combine and control them all, what a fortune! That, if nothing else, might salve him for some of his woes. A tremendous fortune, nothing less. He forever busied himself with various aspects of the scene, quite as a poet might have concerned himself with rocks and rills. To own these street railways, to own these street railways, so ran the song in his mind. Like the gas situation, the Chicago Street Railway situation was divided into three parts, three companies representing and corresponding with the three different sides or divisions of the city. The Chicago City Railway Company, occupying the south side and extending as far south as 39th Street, had been organized in 1859, and represented in itself a mine of wealth. Already it controlled some 70 miles of track, and was annually being added to on Indiana Avenue, on Wabash Avenue, on State Street, and on Archer Avenue. It owned over 150 cars of the old-fashioned, straw-strewn, no-stove type, and over 1,000 horses. It employed 170 conductors, 160 drivers, 100 stablemen and blacksmiths, harness makers and repairers in interesting numbers. Its snowplows were busy on the street in winter, its sprinkling cars in summer. Cowperwood calculated its shares, bonds, rolling stock, and other physical properties as totaling in the vicinity of over $2 million. The trouble with this company was that its outstanding stock was principally controlled by Norman Scrihart, who was now decidedly inimical to Cowperwood, or anything he might wish to do, and by Anson Merrill, who had never manifested any signs of friendship. He did not see how he was to get control of this property. Its shares were selling around $250. The North Chicago City Railway was a corporation which had been organized at the same time as the South Side Company, but by a different group of men. Its management was old, indifferent, and incompetent, its equipment about the same. The Chicago West Division Railway had originally been owned by the Chicago City, or South Side Railway, but was now a separate corporation. It was not yet so profitable as the other divisions of the city, but all sections of the city were growing. The horse bell was heard everywhere, tinkling gaily. Standing on the outside of this scene, contemplating its promise, Cowperwood, much more than anyone else connected financially with the future of these railways at this time, was impressed with their enormous possibilities, their enormous future if Chicago continued to grow, and was concerned with the various factors which might further or impede their progress. Not long before, he had discovered that one of the chief handicaps to street railway development, on the north and west sides, lay in the congestion of traffic at the bridges spanning the Chicago River. Between the street ends that abutted on it, and connected the two sides of the city, ran this amazing stream, dirty, odorous, picturesque, compact of a heavy, delightful, constantly crowding and moving boat traffic, which kept the various bridges momentarily turning, and tied up the street traffic on either side of the river until it seemed at times as though the tangle of teams and boats would never any more be straightened out. It was lovely, human, natural, Dickens-esque, a fit subject for a Daumier, a Turner, or a Whistler. The idlest of bridge tenders judged for himself when the boats and when the teams should be made to wait, and how long, while in addition to the regular pedestrians a group of idlers stood at gaze fascinated by the crowd of masts, the crush of wagons, and the picturesque tugs in the foreground below. Cowperwood, as he sat in his light runabout, annoyed by a delay or dashed swiftly forward to get over before a bridge turned, had long since noted that the streetcar service in the north and west sides was badly hampered. The unbroken south side, unthreaded by a river, had no such problem, and was growing rapidly. Because of this, he was naturally interested to observe one day in the course of his peregrinations that there existed, in two places under the Chicago River, in the first place at LaSalle Street, running north and south, and in the second at Washington Street, running east and west, two now soggy and rat-infested tunnels, which were never used by anybody, dark, dank, dripping affairs only vaguely lighted with oil lamp and oozing with water. Upon investigation, he learned that they had been built years before to accommodate this same tide of wagon traffic which now congested at the bridges, and which even then had been rapidly rising. Being forced to pay a toll in time, to which a slight toll in cash, exacted for the privilege of using a tunnel, had seemed to the investors and public infinitely to be preferred, this traffic had been offered this opportunity of avoiding the delay. However, like many other handsome commercial scheme on paper or bubbling in the human brain, the plan did not work exactly. These tunnels might have proved profitable if they had been properly built, with long, low-percent grades, wide roadways, and a sufficiency of light and air, but as a matter of fact they had not been judiciously adapted to public convenience. Norman Scrihart's father had been an investor in these tunnels, and Anson Merrill. When they had proved unprofitable after a long period of pointless manipulation, cost $1 million, they had been sold to the city for exactly that sum each, it being poetically deemed that a growing city could better afford to lose so disturbing an amount than any of its humble, ambitious, and respectable citizens. That was a little affair by which members of council had profited years before, and that also is another story. After discovering these tunnels, Cowperwood walked through them several times, for though they were now boarded up, there was still an uninterrupted footpath, and wondered why they could not be utilized. It seemed to him that if the streetcar traffic were heavy enough, profitable enough, and these tunnels for a reasonable sum could be made into a lower grade, one of the problems which now hampered the growth of the north and west sides would be obviated. But how? He did not own the tunnels. He did not own the street railways. The cost of leasing and rebuilding the tunnels would be enormous. Helpers and horses and extra drivers on any grade, however slight, would have to be used, and that meant an extra expense. With streetcar horses as the only means of traction, and with the long, expensive grades, he was not so sure that this venture would be a profitable one. However, in the fall of 1880, or a little earlier, when he was still very much entangled with the preliminary sex affairs which led eventually to Rita Solberg, he became aware of a new system of traction relating to streetcars which, together with the arrival of the arc light, the telephone, and other inventions, seemed destined to change the character of city life entirely. Recently, in San Francisco, where the presence of hills made the movement of crowded street railway cars exceedingly difficult, a new type of traction had been introduced, that of the cable, which was nothing more than a traveling rope of wire running over guttered wheels in a conduit, and driven by immense engines, conveniently located in adjacent stations or powerhouses. The cars carried a readily manipulated grip lever, or steel hand, which reached down through a slot into a conduit and gripped the moving cable. This invention solved the problem of hauling heavily laden streetcars up and down steep grades. About the same time, he also heard, in a roundabout way, that the Chicago City Railway, of which Scrihart and Merrill were the principal owners, was about to introduce this mode of traction on its lines, to cable State Street, and attach the cars of other lines, running farther out into unprofitable districts, as trailers. At once, the solution of the north and west side problems flashed upon him. Cables. Outside of the bridge crush and the tunnels above mentioned, there was one other special condition, which had been for some time past attracting Cowperwood's attention. This was the waning energy of the North Chicago City Railway Company, the lack of foresight on the part of its directors which prevented them from perceiving the proper solution of their difficulties. The road was in a rather unsatisfactory state financially, really open to a coup of some sort. In the beginning, it had been considered unprofitable, so thinly populated was the territory they served, and so short the distance from the business heart. Later, however, as the territory filled up, they did better. Only then the long waits at the bridges occurred. The management, feeling that the lines were likely to be poorly patronized, had put down poor, little, light-weight rails, and run slimsy cars, which were as cold as ice in winter and as hot as stove ovens in summer. No attempt had been made to extend the downtown terminus of the several lines into the business center. They stopped just over the river which bordered it at the north. On the south side, Mr. Scrihart had done much better for his patrons. He had already installed a loop for his cable about Merrill's store. As on the west side, straw was strewn in the bottom of all the cars in winter to keep the feet of the passengers warm, and but few open cars were used in summer. The directors were averse to introducing them because of the expense, so they had gone on, adding lines only where they were sure they would make a good profit from the start, putting down the same style of cheap rail that had been used in the beginning, and employing the same antique type of car which rattled and trembled as it ran, until the patrons were enraged to the point of anarchy. Only recently, because of various suits and complaints inaugurated, the company had been greatly annoyed, but they scarcely knew what to do, how to meet the onslaught. Though there was here and there a man of sense, such as Terence Mulgannon, the general superintendent, Edwin Caffrath, the director, William Johnson, the constructing engineer of the company, yet such other men as Onias C. Skinner, the president, and Walter Parker, the vice-president, were reactionaries of an elderly character, conservative, meditative, stingy, and worst of all, fearful or without courage for great adventure. It is a sad commentary that age almost invariably takes away the incentive to new achievement, and makes "let well enough alone" the most appealing motto. Mindful of this, Cowperwood, with a new, splendid scheme in his mind, one day invited John J. McKenty over to his house to dinner on a social pretext. When the latter, accompanied by his wife, had arrived, and Aileen had smiled on them both sweetly and was doing her best to be nice to Mrs. McKenty, Cowperwood remarked, "McKenty, do you know anything about these 2 tunnels that the city owns under the river at Washington and LaSalle Streets? I know that the city took them over when it didn't need them, and that they're no good for anything. That was before my time, though," explained McKenty cautiously. "I think the city paid $1 million for them." "Why?" "Oh, nothing much," replied Cowperwood, evading the matter for the present. "I was wondering whether they were in such condition that they could be used for anything. I see occasional references in the papers to their uselessness." "They're in pretty bad shape, I'm afraid," replied McKenty. "I haven't been through either of them in years and years. The idea was originally to let wagons go through them and break up the crowding at the bridges, but it didn't work. They made the grades too steep and the tolls too high, and so the drivers preferred to wait for the bridges. They were pretty hard on horses. I can testify to that myself. I've driven a wagon load through them more than once. The city should never have taken them over at all by rights. It was a deal. I don't know who all was in it. Carmody was mayor then, and Aldrich was in charge of public works." He relapsed into silence, and Cowperwood allowed the matter of the tunnels to rest until after dinner, when they had adjourned to the library. There he placed a friendly hand on McKenty's arm, an act of familiarity which the politician rather liked. "You felt pretty well satisfied with the way that gas business came out last year, didn't you?" he inquired. "I did," replied McKenty warmly. "Never more so. I told you that at the time." The Irishman liked Cowperwood, and was grateful for the swift manner in which he had been made richer by the sum of several $100,000. "Well now, McKenty," continued Cowperwood abruptly, and with a seeming lack of connection, "has it ever occurred to you that things are shaping up for a big change in the street railway situation here? I can see it coming. There's going to be a new motor power introduced on the South Side within a year or 2. You've heard of it?" "I read something of it," replied McKenty, surprised and a little questioning. He took a cigar and prepared to listen. Cowperwood, never smoking, drew up a chair. "Well, I'll tell you what that means," he explained. "It means that eventually every mile of street railway track in this city, to say nothing of all the additional track that will be built before this change takes place, will have to be done over on an entirely new basis. I mean this cable conduit system. These old companies that are hobbling along now with an old equipment will have to make the change. They'll have to spend millions and millions before they can bring their equipment up to date. If you've paid any attention to the matter, you must have seen what a condition these north and west side lines are in." "It's pretty bad, I know that," commented McKenty. "Just so," replied Cowperwood emphatically. "Well now, if I know anything about these old managements from studying them, they're going to have a hard time bringing themselves to do this. 2 to 3 million are 2 to 3 million, and it isn't going to be an easy matter for them to raise the money. Not as easy, perhaps, as it would be for some of the rest of us, supposing we wanted to get into the street railway business." "Yes, supposing," replied McKenty jovially. "But how are you going to get in it? There's no stock for sale that I know of." "Just the same," said Cowperwood. "We can if we want to, and I'll show you how. But at present, there's just one thing in particular I'd like you to do for me. I want to know if there's any way that we can get control of either of those 2 old tunnels that I was talking to you about a little while ago. I'd like both, if I might. Do you suppose that is possible?" "Why, yes," replied McKenty, wondering. "But what have they got to do with it? They're not worth anything. Some of the boys were talking about filling them in some time ago, blowing them up. The police think crooks hide in them." "Just the same, don't let anyone touch them. Don't lease them or anything," replied Cowperwood forcefully. "I'll tell you frankly what I want to do. I want to get control just as soon as possible of all the street railway lines I can on the north and west sides, new or old franchises. Then you'll see where the tunnels come in, He paused, to see whether McKenty caught the point of all he meant, but the latter failed. "You don't want much, do you?" he said cheerfully. "But I don't see how you can use the tunnels. However, that's no reason why I shouldn't take care of them for you, if you think that's important." "It's this way," said Cowperwood thoughtfully. "I'll make you a preferred partner in all the ventures that I control if you do as I suggest. The street railways, as they stand now, will have to be taken up lock, stock, and barrel and thrown into the scrap heap within 8 or 9 years at the latest. You see what the South Side Company is beginning to do now. When it comes to the West and North Side companies, they won't find it so easy. They aren't earning as much as the South Side, and besides, they have those bridges to cross. That means a severe inconvenience to a cable line. In the first place, the bridges will have to be rebuilt to stand the extra weight and strain. Now the question arises at once, at whose expense? The city's? That depends on who's asking for it," replied Mr. McKenty amiably. "Quite so," assented Cowperwood. "In the next place, this river traffic is becoming impossible from the point of view of a decent streetcar service. There are waits now from 8 to 15 minutes, while these tows and vessels get through. Chicago has 500,000 population today. How much will it have in 1890, in 1900? How will it be when it has 800,000 or 1,000,000? "You're quite right," interpolated McKenty. "It will be pretty bad." "Exactly. But what is worse, the cable lines will carry trailers or single cars from feeder lines. There won't be single cars waiting at these draws. There will be trains, crowded trains. It won't be advisable to delay a cable train for 8 to 15 minutes while boats are making their way through a draw. The public won't stand for that very long, will it, do you think?" "Not without making a row, probably," replied McKenty. "Well, that means what, then?" asked Cowperwood. "Is the traffic going to get any lighter? Is the river going to dry up?" Mr. McKenty stared. Suddenly his face lighted. "Oh, I see," he said shrewdly. "It's those tunnels you're thinking about. Are they in any shape to be used? They can be made over cheaper than new ones can be built." "True for you," replied McKenty. "And if they're in any sort of repair, they'd be just what you want." He was emphatic, almost triumphant. "They belong to the city. They cost pretty near $1,000,000 apiece, those things." "I know it," said Cowperwood. "Now, do you see what I'm driving at?" "Do I see?" smiled McKenty. "That's a real idea you have, Cowperwood. I take off my hat to you. Say what you want." "Well, then, in the first place," replied Cowperwood genially, "it is agreed that the city won't part with those 2 tunnels under any circumstances until we can see what can be done about this other matter. It will not? In the next place, it is understood, is it, that you won't make it any easier than you can possibly help for the North and West Side companies to get ordinances extending their lines or anything else from now on. I shall want to introduce some franchises for feeders and outlying lines myself." "Bring in your ordinances," replied Mr. McKenty, "and I'll do whatever you say. I've worked with you before. I know that you keep your word." "Thanks," said Cowperwood warmly. "I know the value of keeping it. In the meanwhile, I'll go ahead and see what can be done about the other matter. I don't know just how many men I will need to let in on this, or just what form the organization will take, but you may depend upon it that your interests will be properly taken care of, and that whatever is done will be done with your full knowledge and consent." "All very good," answered McKenty, thinking of the new field of activity before them. A combination between himself and Cowperwood in a matter like this must prove very beneficial to both. And he was satisfied, because of their previous relations, that his own interests would not be neglected. "Shall we go and see if we can find the ladies?" asked Cowperwood jauntily, laying hold of the politician's arm. "To be sure," assented McKenty gaily. "It's a fine house you have here, beautiful, and your wife is as pretty a woman as I ever saw, if you'll pardon the familiarity." "I've always thought she was rather attractive myself," replied Cowperwood innocently. Chapter 22. Street Railways at Last. Among the directors of the North Chicago City Company there was one man, Edwin L. Caffrath, who was young and of a forward-looking temperament. His father, a former heavy stockholder of this company, had recently died and left all his holdings and practically his directorship to his only son. Young Caffrath was by no means a practical street railway man, though he fancied he could do very well at it if given a chance. He was the holder of 800 of the 5,000 shares of stock, but the rest of it was so divided that he could only exercise a minor influence. Nevertheless, from the day of his entrance into the company, which was months before Cowperwood began seriously to think over the situation, he had been strong for improvements, extensions, more franchises, better cars, better horses, stoves in the cars in winter, and the like, all of which suggestions sounded to his fellow directors like mere manifestations of the reckless impetuosity of youth, and were almost uniformly opposed. "What's the matter with them cars?" asked Albert Thorson, one of the elder directors, at one of the meetings at which Caffrath was present and offering his usual protest. "I don't see anything the matter with 'em. I ride in 'em." Thorson was a heavy, dusty, tobacco-bestrewn individual of 66, who was a little dull but genial. He was in the paint business, and always wore a very light steel-grey suit, much crinkled in the seat and arms. "Perhaps that's what's the matter with them, Albert," chirped up Solon Kempfert, one of his cronies on the board. The sally drew a laugh. "Oh, I don't know. I see the rest of you on board often enough." "Why, I tell you what's the matter with them," replied Caffrath. "They're dirty, and they're flimsy, and the windows rattle so you can't hear yourself think. The track is no good, and the filthy straw we keep in them in winter is enough to make a person sick. We don't keep the track in good repair. I don't wonder people complain. I'd complain myself." "Oh, I don't think things are as bad as all that," put in Onias C. Skinner, the president, who had a face which, with its very short side whiskers, was as bland as a Chinese god. He was 68 years of age. "They're not the best cars in the world, but they're good cars. They need painting and varnishing pretty badly, some of them, but outside of that there's many a good year's wear in them yet. I'd be very glad if we could put in new rolling stock, but the item of expense will be considerable. It's these extensions that we have to keep building, and the long hauls for 5 cents which eat up the profits." The so-called long hauls were only 2 or 3 miles at the outside, but they seemed long to Mr. Skinner. "Well, look at the south side," persisted Caffrath. "I don't know what you people are thinking of. Here's a cable system introduced in Philadelphia. There's another in San Francisco. Someone has invented a car, as I understand it, that's going to run by electricity. And here we are, running cars, barns, I call them, with straw in them. Good Lord, I should think it was about time that some of us took a tumble to ourselves." "Oh, I don't know," commented Mr. Skinner. "It seems to me we have done pretty well by the north side. We have done a good deal." Directors Solon Kempfert, Albert Thorson, Isaac White, Anthony Ure, Arnold C. Benjamin, and Otto Matches, being solemn gentlemen all, merely sat and stared. The vigorous Caffrath was not to be so easily repressed, however. He repeated his complaints on other occasions. The fact that there was also considerable complaint in the newspapers from time to time in regard to this same North Side service pleased him in a way. Perhaps this would be the proverbial fire under the terrapin which would cause it to move along. By this time, owing to Cowperwood's understanding with McKenty, all possibility of the North Side Company's securing additional franchises for unoccupied streets, or even the use of the LaSalle Street Tunnel, had ended. Caffrath did not know this. Neither did the directors or officers of the company, but it was true. In addition, McKenty, through the aldermen, who were at his beck and call on the north side, were beginning to stir up additional murmurs and complaints in order to discredit the present management. There was a great to-do in council over a motion on the part of somebody to compel the North Side Company to throw out its old cars and lay better and heavier track. Curiously, this did not apply so much to the west and south sides, which were in the same condition. The rank and file of the city, ignorant of the tricks which were constantly being employed in politics to effect one end or another, were greatly cheered by this so-called public uprising. They little knew the pawns they were in the game, or how little sincerity constituted the primal impulse. Quite by accident, apparently, one day Addison, thinking of the different men in the Northside Company who might be of service to Cowperwood, and having finally picked young Caffrath as the ideal agent, introduced himself to the latter at the Union League. "That's a pretty heavy load of expense that's staring you North and West Side Street Railway people in the face," he took occasion to observe. "How's that?" asked Caffrath cautiously, anxious to hear anything which concerned the development of the business. "Well, unless I'm greatly mistaken, you, all of you, are going to be put to the expense of doing over your lines completely in a very little while, so I hear, introducing this new motor or cable system that they're getting on the South Side." Addison wanted to convey the impression that the city council or public sentiment or something was going to force the North Chicago Company to indulge in this great and expensive series of improvements. Caffrath pricked up his ears. What was the city council going to do? He wanted to know all about it. They discussed the whole situation, the nature of the cable conduits, the cost of the powerhouses, the need of new rails, and the necessity of heavier bridges, or some other means of getting over or under the river. Addison took very good care to point out that the Chicago City or South Side Railway was in a much more fortunate position than either of the other two by reason of its freedom from the river-crossing problem. Then he again commiserated the North Side Company on its rather difficult position. "Your company will have a great deal to do, I fancy," he reiterated. Caffrath was duly impressed, and appropriately depressed, for his 800 shares would be depressed in value by the necessity of heavy expenditures for tunnel and other improvements. Nevertheless, there was some consolation in the thought that such betterment as Addison now described would in the long run make the lines more profitable. But in the meantime, there might be rough sailing. The old directors ought to act soon now, he thought. With the Southside Company being done over, they would have to follow suit. But would they? How could he get them to see that, even though it were necessary to mortgage the lines for years to come, it would pay in the long run? He was sick of old conservative, cautious methods. After the lapse of a few weeks, Addison, still acting for Cowperwood, had a second and private conference with Caffrath. He said, after exacting a promise of secrecy for the present, that since their previous conversation he had become aware of new developments. In the interval, he had been visited by several men of long connection with street railways in other localities. They had been visiting various cities, looking for a convenient outlet for their capital, and had finally picked on Chicago. They had looked over the various lines here, and had decided that the North Chicago City Railway was as good a field as any. He then elaborated with exceeding care the idea which Cowperwood had outlined to him. Caffrath, dubious at first, was finally won over. He had too long chafed under the dusty, poky attitude of the old regime. He did not know who these new men were, but this scheme was in line with his own ideas. It would require, as Addison pointed out, the expenditure of several millions of dollars, and he did not see how the money could be raised without outside assistance, unless the lines were heavily mortgaged. If these new men were willing to pay a high rate of 51% of this stock for 99 years, and would guarantee a satisfactory rate of interest on all the stock as it stood, besides inaugurating a forward policy, why not let them? It would be just as good as mortgaging the soul out of the old property, and the management was of no value anyhow. Caffrath could not see how fortunes were to be made for these new investors out of subsidiary construction and equipment companies, in which Cowperwood would be interested, how by issuing watered stock on the old and new lines the latter need scarcely lay down a dollar once he had the necessary opening capital, the talking capital, as he was fond of calling it, guaranteed. Cowperwood and Addison had by now agreed, if this went through, to organize the Chicago Trust Company with millions back of it to manipulate all their deals. Caffrath only saw a better return on his stock, possibly a chance to get in on the ground plan, as a new phrase expressed it, of the new company. That's what I've been telling these fellows for the past 3 years, he finally explained to Addison, flattered by the latter's personal attention and awed by his great influence. But they never have been willing to listen to me. The way this North Side system has been managed is a crime. Why, a child could do better than we have done. They've saved on track and rolling stock and lost on population. People are what we want up there, and there is only one way that I know of to get them, and that is to give them decent car service. I'll tell you frankly, we've never done it. Not long after this, Cowperwood had a short talk with Caffrath, in which he promised the latter not only $600 a share for all the stock he possessed, or would part with on lease, but a bonus of new company stock for his influence. Caffrath returned to the North Side jubilant for himself and for his company. He decided after due thought that a roundabout way would best serve Cowperwood's ends, a line of subtle suggestion from some seemingly disinterested party. Consequently, he caused William Johnson, the directing engineer, to reproach Albert Thorson, one of the most vulnerable of the directors, declaring he had heard privately that Isaac White, Arnold C. Benjamin, and Otto Maches, 3 other directors and the heaviest owners, had been offered a very remarkable price for their stock, and that they were going to sell, leaving the others out in the cold. Thorson was beside himself with grief. "When did you hear that?" he asked. Johnson told him, but for the time being kept the source of his information secret. Thorson at once hurried to his friend Solon Kempfert, who in turn went to Caffrath for information. "I have heard something to that effect," was Caffrath's only comment, "but really I do not know." Thereupon Thorson and Kempfert imagined that Caffrath was in the conspiracy to sell out and leave them with no particularly valuable pickings. It was very sad. Meanwhile, Cowperwood, on the advice of Caffrath, was approaching Isaac White, Arnold C. Benjamin, and Otto Maches direct, talking with them as if they were the only 3 he desired to deal with. A little later, Thorson and Kempfert were visited in the same spirit, and agreed in secret fear to sell out, or rather, lease, at the very advantageous terms Cowperwood offered, providing he could get the others to do likewise. This gave the latter a strong backing of sentiment on the board. Finally, Isaac White stated at one of the meetings that he had been approached with an interesting proposition, which he then and there outlined. He was not sure what to think, he said, but the board might like to consider it. At once Thorson and Kempfert were convinced that all Johnson had suggested was true. It was decided to have Cowperwood come and explain to the full board just what his plan was, and this he did, in a long, bland, smiling talk. It was made plain that the road would have to be put in shape in the near future, and that this proposed plan relieved all of them of work, worry, and care. Moreover, they were guaranteed more interest at once than they had expected to earn in the next 20 or 30 years. Thereupon it was agreed that Cowperwood and his plan should be given a trial. Seeing that if he did not succeed in paying the proposed interest promptly, the property once more became theirs, so they thought, and that he assumed all obligations, taxes, water rents, old claims, a few pensions, it appeared in the light of a rather idyllic scheme. "Well, boys, I think this is a pretty good day's work myself," observed Anthony Ewer, laying a friendly hand on the shoulder of Mr. Albert Thorson. "I'm sure we can all unite in wishing Mr. Cowperwood luck with his adventure." Mr. Ewer's 715 shares, worth $71,500, having risen to a valuation of $429,000, he was naturally jubilant. "You're right," replied Thorson, who was parting with 480 shares out of a total of 790, and seeing them all bounce in value from $200 to $600. "He's an interesting man. I hope he succeeds." Cowperwood, waking the next morning in Aileen's room, he had been out late the night before with McKenty, Addison, Videra, and others, turned, and patting her neck where she was dozing, said, "Well, pet, yesterday afternoon I wound up that North Chicago Street Railway deal. I'm president of the new North Side Company just as soon as I get my board of directors organized. We're going to be some real consequence in this village after all in a year or 2. He was hoping that this fact, among other things, would end in mollifying Aileen toward him. She had been so gloomy, remote, weary these many days, ever since the terrific assault on Rita. "Yes," she replied, with a half-hearted smile, rubbing her waking eyes. She was clad in a foamy nightgown of white and pink. "That's nice, isn't it?" Cowperwood brought himself up on one elbow and looked at her, smoothing her round, bare arms, which he always admired. The luminous richness of her hair had never lost its charm completely. "That means that I can do the same thing with the Chicago West Division Company in a year or so," he went on. "But there's going to be a lot of talk about this, I'm afraid, and I don't want that just now. It will work out all right. I can see Scryhart and Merrill and some of these other people taking notice pretty soon. They've missed out on two of the biggest things Chicago ever had, gas and railways." "Oh yes, Frank, I'm glad for you," commented Aileen, rather drearily, who, in spite of her sorrow over his defection, was still glad that he was going on and forward. "You'll always do all right." "I wish you wouldn't feel so badly, Aileen," he said, with a kind of affectional protest. "Aren't you going to try to be happy with me? This is as much for you as for me. You will be able to pay up old scores even better than I will." He smiled winningly. "Yes," she replied reproachfully, but tenderly at that, a little sorrowfully. "A lot of good money does me. It was your love I wanted." "But you have that," he insisted. "I've told you that over and over. I never ceased to care for you, really. You know I didn't." "Yes, I know," she replied, even as he gathered her close in his arms. "I know how you care." But that did not prevent her from responding to him warmly, for back of all her fuming protest was heartache, the wish to have his love intact, to restore that pristine affection which she had once assumed would endure forever. Chapter 23. The Power of the Press. The morning papers, in spite of the efforts of Cowperwood and his friends to keep this transfer secret, shortly thereafter were full of rumors of a change in North Chicago. Frank Algernon Cowperwood, hitherto unmentioned in connection with Chicago Street Railways, was pointed to as the probable successor to Ananias C. Skinner, and Edwin L. Caffrath, one of the old directors, as future vice president. The men back of the deal were referred to as, in all likelihood, Eastern capitalists. Cowperwood, as he sat in Aileen's room examining the various morning papers, saw that before the day was over he would be sought out for an expression of opinion and further details. He proposed to ask the newspaper men to wait a few days until he could talk to the publishers of the papers themselves, win their confidence, and then announce a general policy. It would be something that would please the city and the residents of the North Side in particular. At the same time, he did not care to promise anything which he could not easily and profitably perform. He wanted fame and reputation, but he wanted money even more. He intended to get both. To one who had been working thus long in the minor realms of finance, as Cowperwood considered that he had so far been doing, this sudden upward step into the more conspicuous regions of high finance and control was an all-inspiring thing. So long had he been stirring about in a lesser region, paving the way by hours and hours of private thought and conference and scheming, that now, when he actually had achieved his end, he could scarcely believe for the time being that it was true. Chicago was such a splendid city. It was growing fast. Its opportunities were so wonderful. These men, who had thus foolishly parted with an indefinite lease of their holdings, had not really considered what they were doing. This matter of Chicago Street Railways, once he had them well in hand, could be made to yield such splendid profits. He could incorporate and overcapitalize. Many subsidiary lines, which McKenty would secure for him for a song, would be worth millions in the future, and they should be his entirely. He would not be indebted to the directors of the old North Chicago Company for any interest on those. By degrees, year by year, as the city grew, the lines which were still controlled by this old company, but were practically his, would become a mere item, a central core, in the so very much larger system of new lines which he would build up about it. Then the West Side and even the South Side sections. But why dream? He might readily become the sole master of street railway traffic in Chicago. He might readily become the most princely financial figure in the city, and one of the few great financial magnates of the nation. In any public enterprise of any kind, as he knew, where the suffrages of the people or the privileges in their possessions are desired, the newspapers must always be considered. As Cowperwood even now was casting hungry eyes in the direction of the two tunnels, one to be held in view of an eventual assumption of the Chicago West Division Company, the other to be given to the North Chicago Street Railway, which he had now organized, it was necessary to make friends with the various publishers. How to go about it? Recently, because of the influx of a heavy native and foreign-born population, thousands and thousands of men of all sorts and conditions, looking for the work which the growth of the city seemed to promise, and because of the dissemination of stirring ideas through radical individuals of foreign groups concerning anarchism, socialism, communism, and the like, the civic idea in Chicago had become most acute. This very May, in which Cowperwood had been going about attempting to adjust matters in his favor, there had been a tremendous national flare-up, when in a great public place on the west side, known as the Haymarket, at one of a number of labor meetings, dubbed anarchistic because of the principles of some of the speakers, a bomb had been hurled by some excited fanatic, which had exploded and maimed or killed a number of policemen, injuring slightly several others. This had brought to the fore once and for all, as by a flash of lightning, the whole problem of mass against class, and had given it such an airing as in view of the cheerful, optimistic, almost inconsequential American mind had not previously been possible. It changed, quite as an eruption might, the whole face of the commercial landscape. Man thought thereafter somewhat more accurately of national and civic things. What was anarchism? What socialism? What rights had the rank and file, anyhow, in economic and governmental development? Such were interesting questions, and following the bomb, which acted as a great stone cast in the water, these ripple rings of thought were still widening and emanating until they took in such supposedly remote and impregnable quarters as editorial offices, banks, and financial institutions generally, and the haunts of political dignitaries and their jobs. In the face of this, however, Cowperwood was not disturbed. He did not believe in either the strength of the masses or their ultimate rights, though he sympathized with the condition of individuals, and did believe that men like himself were sent into the world to better perfect its mechanisms and habitable order. Often now, in these preliminary days, he looked at the large companies of men, with their horses gathered in and about the several car-barns of the company, and wondered at their state. So many of them were so dull. They were rather like animals, patient, inartistic, hopeless. He thought of their shabby homes, their long hours, their poor pay, and then concluded that if anything at all could be done for them, it would be pay them decent living wages, which he proposed to do, nothing more. They could not be expected to understand his dreams or his visions, or to share in the magnificence and social dominance which he craved. He finally decided that it would be as well for him to personally visit the various newspaper publishers and talk the situation over with them. Addison, when consulted as to this project, was somewhat dubious. He had small faith in the newspapers. He had seen them play petty politics, follow up enmities and personal grudges, and even sell out in certain cases for pathetically small rewards. "I tell you how it is, Frank," remarked Addison on one occasion. "You will have to do all this business on cotton heels, practically. You know that old gas crowd is still down on you, in spite of the fact that you are one of their largest stockholders. Scrihart isn't at all friendly, and he practically owns the Chronicle. Ricketts will just about say what he wants him to say. Hyssop of the Mail and the Transcript is an independent man, but he's a Presbyterian and a cold, self-righteous moralist. Braxton's paper, the Globe, practically belongs to Merrill, but Braxton's a nice fellow at that. Old General MacDonald of the Enquirer is old General MacDonald, is all according to how he feels when he gets up in the morning. If he should chance to like your looks, he might support you forever and forever, until you crossed his conscience in some way. He's a fine old walrus. I like him. Neither Scrihart nor Merrill nor anyone else can get anything out of him unless he wants to give it. He may not live so many years, however, and I don't trust that son of his." Hagnin of the press is all right and friendly to you, as I understand. Other things being equal, I think he'd naturally support you in anything he thought was fair and reasonable. Well, there you have them. Get them all on your side if you can. Don't ask for the LaSalle Street tunnel right away. Let it come as an afterthought, a great public need. The main thing will be to avoid having the other companies stirring up a real fight against you. Depend on it, Scryhart will be thinking pretty hard about this whole business from now on. As for Merrill, well, if you can show him where he can get something out of it for his store, I guess he'll be for you. It is one of the splendid yet sinister fascinations of life that there is no tracing to their ultimate sources all the winds of influence that play upon a given bark, all the breaths of chance that fill or desert our bellied or our sagging sails. We plan and plan, but who by taking thought can add a cubit to his stature? Who can overcome or even assist the providence that shapes our ends, rough hew them as we may? Cowperwood was now entering upon a great public career, and the various editors and public personalities of the city were watching him with interest. Augustus M. Hagnin, a free agent with his organ, the press, and yet not free either because he was harnessed to the necessity of making his paper pay, was most interested. Lacking the commanding magnetism of a man like MacDonald, he was nevertheless an honest man, well-intentioned, thoughtful, careful. Hagnin, ever since the outcome of Cowperwood's gas transaction, had been intensely interested in the latter's career. It seemed to him that Cowperwood was probably destined to become a significant figure. Raw, glittering force, however, compounded of the cruel Machiavellianism of nature, if it be but Machiavellian, seems to exercise a profound attraction for the conventionally rooted. Your cautious citizen, of average means, looking out through the eyes of his dull world of seeming fact, is often the first to forgive or condone the grim butcheries of theory by which the strong rise. Hagnin, observing Cowperwood, conceived of him as a man perhaps as much sinned against as sinning, a man who would be faithful to friends, one who could be relied upon in hours of great stress. As it happened, the Hagnins were neighbors of the Cowperwoods, and since those days when the latter had attempted unsuccessfully to enter Chicago society, this family had been as acceptable as any of those who had remained friendly. And so when Cowperwood arrived one day at the office of the press, in a blowing snowstorm, it was just before the Christmas holidays, Hagnin was glad to see him. "It's certainly real winter weather we're having now, isn't it?" he observed cheerfully. "How goes the North Chicago Street Railway business?" For months he and the other publishers had been aware that the whole North Side was to be made over by fine cable tracks, powerhouses, and handsome cars, and there already was talk that some better arrangement was to be made to bring the passengers into the downtown section. "Mr. Hagnin," said Cowperwood smilingly. He was arrayed in a heavy fur coat, with a collar of beaver and driving gauntlets of dogskin. "We've reached the place in this street railway problem on the North Side where we are going to require the assistance of the newspapers, or at least their friendly support. At present our principal difficulty is that all our lines, when they come downtown, stop at Lake Street, just this side of the bridges. That means a long walk for everybody to all the streets south of it, and as you probably know, there has been considerable complaint. Besides that, this river traffic is becoming more and more what I may say it has been for years, an intolerable nuisance. We've all suffered from it. No effort has ever been made to regulate it, and because it is so heavy, I doubt whether it can ever be systematized in any satisfactory way. The best thing in the long run would be to tunnel under the river, but that is such an expensive proposition that, as things are now, we are in no position to undertake it. The traffic on the North Side does not warrant it. It really does not warrant the reconstruction of the 3 bridges, which we now use at State, Dearborn, and Clark. Yet if we introduce the cable system which we now propose, these bridges will have to be done over. It seems to me, seeing that this is an enterprise in which the public is as much interested almost as we are, that it would only be fair if the city should help pay for this reconstruction work. All the land adjacent to these lines and the property served by them will be greatly enhanced in value. The city's taxing power will rise tremendously. I've talked to several financiers here in Chicago, and they agree with me. But, as is usual in all such cases, I find that some of the politicians are against me. Since I have taken charge of the North Chicago Company, the attitude of one or two papers has not been any too friendly. In the Chronicle, controlled by Scryhart, there had already been a number of references to the probability that now, since Cowperwood and his friends were in charge, the skyrocketing tactics of the old Lakeview, Hyde Park, and other gas organizations would be repeated. Braxton's Globe, owned by Merrill, being semi-neutral, had merely suggested that it hoped that no such methods would be repeated here. Perhaps you may know, Cowperwood continued, that we have a very sweeping program of improvement in mind, if we can obtain proper public consideration and assistance. At this point he reached down in one of his pockets and drew forth astutely drafted maps and blueprints, especially prepared for this occasion. They showed main cable lines on North Clark, LaSalle, and Wells Streets. These lines coming downtown converged at Illinois and LaSalle Streets on the north side, and though Cowperwood made no reference to it at the moment, they were indicated on the map in red as running over or under the river at LaSalle Street, where was no bridge, and emerging therefrom following a loop along LaSalle to Monroe, to Dearborn, to Randolph, and thence into the tunnel again. Cowperwood allowed Hagnin to gather the very interesting traffic significance of it all before he proceeded. On the map, Mr. Hagnin, I've indicated a plan which, if we can gain the consent of the city, will obviate any quarrel as to the great expense of restructuring the bridges, and will make use of a piece of property which is absolutely without value to the city at present, but which can be made into something of vast convenience to the public. I'm referring, as you see," he laid an indicative finger on the map in Mr. Hagnin's hands, "to the old LaSalle Street tunnel, which is now boarded up and absolutely of no use to anyone. It was built, apparently, under a misapprehension as to the grade the average loaded wagon could negotiate. When it was found to be unprofitable, it was sold to the city and locked up. If you have ever been through it, you know what condition it is in. My engineers tell me the walls are leaking, and that there is great danger of a cave-in, unless it is very speedily repaired. I'm also told that it will require about $400,000 to put it in suitable condition for use. My theory is that if the North Chicago Street Railway is willing to go to this expense for the sake of solving this bridge crush problem, and giving the residents of the North Side a sensible and uninterrupted service into the business heart, the city ought to be willing to make us a present of this tunnel for the time being, or at least a long lease at a purely nominal rental." Cowperwood paused to see what Hagnin would say. The latter was looking at the map gravely, wondering whether it was fair for Cowperwood to make this demand, wondering whether the city would grant it to him without compensation, wondering whether the bridge traffic problem was as serious as he pointed out, wondering indeed whether this whole move was not a clever ruse to obtain something for nothing. "And what is this?" he asked, laying a finger on the aforementioned loop. "That," replied Cowperwood, "is the only method we have been able to figure out of serving the downtown business section and the north side and of solving this bridge problem. If we obtain the tunnel, as I hope we shall, all the cars of these north side lines will emerge here," he pointed to LaSalle and Randolph, "and swing around. That is, they will if the city council give us the right of way. I think, of course, there can be no reasonable objection to that. There is no reason why the citizens of the north side shouldn't have as comfortable an access to the business heart as those of the west or south side. None in the world," Mr. Hagnin was compelled to admit. "Are you satisfied, however, that the council and the city should sanction the gift of a loop of this kind without some form of compensation?" "I see no reason why they shouldn't," replied Cowperwood, in a somewhat injured tone. "There has never been any question of compensation where other improvements have been suggested for the city in the past. The South Side Company has been allowed to turn in a loop around State and Wabash. The Chicago City Passenger Railway has a loop in Adams and Washington Streets." "Quite so," said Mr. Hagnin vaguely. "That is true. But this tunnel, now, do you think that should fall in the same category of public beneficences?" At the same time, he could not help thinking, as he looked at the proposed loop indicated on the map, that the new cable line, with its string of trailers, would give downtown Chicago a truly metropolitan air, and would provide a splendid outlet for the north side. The streets in question were magnificent commercial thoroughfares, crowded even at this date with structures 5, 6, 7, and even 8 stories high, and brimming with heavy streams of eager life, young, fresh, optimistic. Because of the narrow area into which the commercial life of the city tended to congest itself, this property and these streets were immensely valuable, among the most valuable in the whole city. Also, he observed that if this loop did come here, its cars, on their return trip along Dearborn Street, would pass by his very door, the office of the press, thereby enhancing the value of that property of which he was the owner. "I certainly do, Mr. Hagnen," returned Cowperwood emphatically in answer to his query. "Personally, I should think Chicago would be glad to pay a bonus to get its street railway service straightened out, especially where a corporation comes forward with a liberal, conservative program such as this. It means millions in growth of property values on the North Side. It means millions to the business heart to have this loop system laid down just as I suggest." He put his finger firmly on the map which he had brought, and Hagnen agreed with him that the plan was undoubtedly a sound business proposition. "Personally, I should be the last to complain," he added, "for the line passes my door. At the same time, this tunnel, as I understand it, cost in the neighborhood of $800,000 or $1 million. It is a delicate problem. I should like to know what the other editors think of it, and how the city council itself would feel toward it." Cowperwood nodded. Certainly, he said, "with pleasure. I would not come here at all if I did not feel that I had a perfectly legitimate proposition, one that the press of the city should unite in supporting. Where a corporation such as ours is facing large expenditures, which have to be financed by outside capital, it is only natural that we should wish to allay useless, groundless opposition in advance. I hope we may command your support." "I hope you may," smiled Mr. Hagnen. They parted the best of friends. The other publishers, guardians of the city's privileges, were not quite so genial as Hagnen in their approval of Cowperwood's proposition. The use of a tunnel, and several of the most important downtown streets, might readily be essential to the development of Cowperwood's North Side schemes, but the gift of them was a different matter. Already, as a matter of fact, the various publishers and editors had been consulted by Scrihart, Merrill, and others with a view to discovering how they felt as to this new venture, and whether Cowperwood would be cheerfully endorsed or not. Scrihart, smarting from the wounds he had received in the gas war, viewed this new activity on Cowperwood's part with a suspicious and envious eye. To him, much more than to the others, it spelled a new and dangerous foe in the street railway field, although all the leading citizens of Chicago were interested. "I suppose now," he said one evening to the Honorable Walter Melville Hyssop, editor and publisher of the Transcript and the Evening Mail, whom he met at the Union League, "that this fellow Cowperwood will attempt some disturbing coup in connection with street railway affairs. He is just the sort. I think from an editorial point of view his political connections will bear watching." Already there were rumors abroad that McKenty might have something to do with the new company. Hyssop, a medium-sized, ornate, conservative person, was not so sure. "We shall find out soon enough, no doubt. What propositions Mr. Cowperwood has in hand," he remarked. "He is very energetic and capable, as I understand it." Hyssop and Scrihart, as well as the latter and Merrill, had been social friends for years and years. After his call on Mr. Hagnen, Cowperwood's naturally selective and self-protective judgment led him next to the office of the Enquirer, old General MacDonald's paper, where he found that because of rheumatism and the severe inclement weather of Chicago, the old general had sailed only a few days before for Italy. His son, an aggressive mercantile type of youth of 32, and a managing editor by the name of Dubois, were acting in his stead. In the son, Truman Leslie MacDonald, an intense, calm, and penetrating young man, Cowperwood encountered someone who, like himself, saw life only from the point of view of sharp, self-centered personal advantage. What was he, Truman Leslie MacDonald, to derive from any given situation, and how was he to make the Enquirer an even greater property than it had been under his father before him? He did not propose to be overwhelmed by the old general's rather flowery reputation. At the same time, he meant to become imposingly rich. An active member of a young and very smart set, which had been growing up on the North Side, he rode, drove, was instrumental in organizing a new and exclusive country club, and despised the rank and file as unsuited to the fine atmosphere to which he aspired. Mr. Clifford Dubois, The managing editor was a cool reprobate of 40, masquerading as a gentleman, and using the Inquirer in subtle ways for furthering his personal ends, and that under the old general's very nose. He was osseous, sandy-haired, blue-eyed, with a keen, formidable nose and a solid chin. Clifford Dubois was always careful never to let his left hand know what his right hand did. It was this sapient pair that received Cowperwood in the old general's absence, first in Mr. Dubois's room, and then in that of Mr. MacDonald. The latter had already heard much of Cowperwood's doings. Men who had been connected with the old gas war, Jordan Jules, for instance, president of the old North Chicago Gas Company, and Hudson Baker, president of the old West Chicago Gas Company, had denounced him long before as a buccaneer who had pirated them out of very comfortable sinecures. Here he was now, invading the North Chicago Street Railway field, and coming with startling schemes for the reorganization of the downtown business heart. Why shouldn't the city have something in return? Or, better yet, those who helped to formulate the public opinion so influential in the success of Cowperwood's plans. Truman Leslie MacDonald, as has been said, did not see life from his father's point of view at all. He had in mind a sharp bargain, which he could drive with Cowperwood during the old general's absence. The general need never know. "I understand your point of view, Mr. Cowperwood," he commented loftily, "but where does the city come in? I see very clearly how important this is to the people of the North Side, and even to the merchants and real estate owners in the downtown section. But that simply means that it is 10 times as important to you. Undoubtedly it will help the city, but the city is growing anyhow, and that will help you. I've said all along that these public franchises were worth more than they used to be worth. Nobody seems to see it very clearly as yet, but it's true just the same. That tunnel is worth more now than the day it was built. Even if the city can't use it, somebody can." He was meaning to indicate a rival car line. Cowperwood bristled internally. "That's all very well," he said, preserving his surface composure, "but why make fish of one and flesh of another? The Southside Company has a loop for which it never paid $1, so it's the Chicago City Passenger Railway. The North Side Company is planning more extensive improvements than were ever undertaken by any single company before. I hardly think it is fair to raise the question of compensation and a franchise tax at this time, and in connection with this one company only. Well, that may be true of the other companies. The Southside Company had those streets long ago, they merely connected them up. But this tunnel, now, that's a different matter, isn't it? The city bought and paid for that, didn't it?" "Quite true. To help out men who saw that they couldn't make another dollar out of it," said Cowperwood acidly. "But it's of no use to the city. It will cave in pretty soon if it isn't repaired. Why, the consent of property owners alone along the line of this loop is going to aggregate a considerable sum. It seems to me instead of hampering a great work of this kind, the public ought to do everything in its power to assist it. It means giving a new metropolitan flavor to this downtown section. It is time Chicago was getting out of its swaddling clothes." Mr. MacDonald the younger shook his head. He saw clearly enough the significance of the points made, but he was jealous of Cowperwood and of his success. This loop franchise and tunnel gift meant millions for someone. Why shouldn't there be something in it for him? He called in Mr. Dubois and went over the proposition with him. Quite without effort, the latter sensed the drift of the situation. "It's an excellent proposition," he said. "I don't see but the city should have something, though. Public sentiment is rather against gifts to corporations just at present." Cowperwood caught the drift of what was in young MacDonald's mind. "Well, what would you suggest as a fair rate of compensation to the city?" he asked cautiously, wondering whether this aggressive youth would go so far as to commit himself in any way. "Oh, well, as to that," MacDonald replied, with a deprecatory wave of his hand, "I couldn't say. It ought to bear a reasonable relationship to the value of the utility as it now stands. I should want to think that over. I shouldn't want to see the city demand anything unreasonable. Certainly, though, there is a privilege here that is worth something." Cowperwood flared inwardly. His greatest weakness, if he had one, was that he could but ill brook opposition of any kind. This young upstart, with his thin, cool face and sharp, hard eyes, he would have liked to tell him and his paper to go to the devil. He went away hoping that he could influence the Inquirer in some other way upon the old general's return. As he was sitting next morning in his office in North Clark Street, he was aroused by the still novel-sounding bell of the telephone, one of the earliest in use, on the wall back of him. After a parley with his secretary, he was informed that a gentleman connected with the Inquirer wished to speak with him. "This is the Inquirer," said a voice, which Cowperwood, his ear to the receiver, thought he recognized as that of young Truman MacDonald, the general's son. "You wanted to know," continued the voice, "what would be considered adequate compensation so far as that tunnel matter is concerned. Can you hear me?" "Yes," replied Cowperwood. "Well, I should not care to influence your judgment one way or the other, but if my opinion were asked, I should say about $50,000 worth of North Chicago Street Railway stock would be satisfactory." The voice was young, clear, steely. "To whom would you suggest that it might be paid?" Cowperwood asked softly, quite genially. "That also, I would suggest, might be left to your very sound judgment." The voice ceased. The receiver hung up. "Well, I'll be damned," Cowperwood said, looking at the floor reflectively. A smile spread over his face. "I'm not going to be held up like that. I don't need to be. It isn't worth it. Not at present, anyhow." His teeth set. He was underestimating Mr. Truman Leslie MacDonald principally because he did not like him. He thought his father might return and oust him. It was one of the most vital mistakes he ever made in his life. Chapter 24. The Coming of Stephanie Platoff. During this period of what might have been called financial and commercial progress, the affairs of Aileen and Cowperwood had been to a certain extent smoothed over. Each summer now, partly to take Aileen's mind off herself and partly to satisfy his own desire to see the world and collect objects of art, in which he was becoming more and more interested, it was Cowperwood's custom to make with his wife a short trip abroad, or to foreign American lands, visiting in these 2 years Russia, Scandinavia, Argentine, Chile, and Mexico. Their plan was to leave in May or June with the outward rush of traffic and return in September or early October. His idea was to soothe Aileen as much as possible, to fill her mind with pleasing anticipations as to her eventual social triumph somewhere, in New York or London, if not Chicago, to make her feel that, in spite of his physical desertion, he was still spiritually loyal. By now, also, Cowperwood was so shrewd that he had the ability to simulate an affection and practice a gallantry which he did not feel, or rather, that was not backed by real passion. He was the soul of attention. He would buy her flowers, jewels, knickknacks, and ornaments. He would see that her comfort was looked after to the last detail, and yet, at the very same moment, perhaps, he would be looking cautiously about to see what life might offer in the way of illicit entertainment. Aileen knew this, although she could not prove it to be true. At the same time, she had an affection and an admiration for the man which gripped her in spite of herself. You have perhaps pictured to yourself the mood of some general who has perhaps suffered a great defeat, the employee who after years of faithful service finds himself discharged. What shall life say to the loving when their love is no longer of any value, when all that has been placed upon the altar of affection has been found to be a vain sacrifice? Philosophy? Give that to dolls to play with. Religion? Seek first the metaphysically minded. Aileen was no longer the lithe, forceful, dynamic girl of 1865, when Cowperwood first met her. She was still beautiful, it is true, a fair, full-blown, matronly creature, not more than 35, looking perhaps 30, feeling, alas, that she was a girl and still as attractive as ever. It is a grim thing to a woman, however fortunately placed, to realize that age is creeping on, and that love, that singing will-o'-the-wisp, is fading into the ultimate dark. Aileen, within the hour of her greatest triumph, had seen love die. It was useless to tell herself, as she did sometimes, that it might come back, revive. Her ultimately realistic temperament told her this could never be. Though she had routed Rita Solberg, she was fully aware that Cowperwood's original constancy was gone. She was no longer happy. Love was dead. That sweet illusion, with its pearly pink for heart and borders, That laughing cherub that lures with cupid mouth and misty eye, that young tendril of the vine of life that whispers of eternal springtime, that calls and calls where aching, wearied feet by legion follow, was no longer in existence. In vain the tears, the storms of self-tortures, in vain the looks in the mirror, the studied examination of plump, sweet features still fresh and inviting. One day, at the sight of tired circles under her eyes, she ripped from her neck a lovely ruche that she was adjusting, and throwing herself on the bed, cried as though her heart would break. Why primp? Why ornament? Her Frank did not love her. What to her now was a handsome residence in Michigan Avenue, the refinements of a French boudoir, or clothing that ran the gamut of the dressmaker's arts, hats that were like orchids blooming in serried rows. In vain, in vain. Like the raven that perched above the lintel of the door, sad memory was here, grave in her widow weeds, crying, "Nevermore." Aileen knew that the sweet illusion which had bound Cowperwood to her for a time had gone, and would never come again. He was here. His step was in the room, mornings and evenings. At night, for long, prosaic, uninterrupted periods, she could hear him breathing by her side, his hand on her body. There were other nights when he was not there, when he was out of the city, and she resigned herself to accept his excuses at their face value. Why quarrel, she asked herself. What could she do? She was waiting. Waiting, but for what? And Cowperwood, noting the strange, unalterable changes which time works in us all, the inward lap of the marks of age, the fluted recession of that splendor and radiance which is youth, sighed at times, perhaps, but turned his face to that dawn which is forever breaking where youth is. Not for him that poetic loyalty which substitutes for the perfection of young love its memories, or takes for the glitter of passion and desire that once was the happy thoughts of companionship, the crystal memories that like early dews concealed remain beaded recollections to comfort or torture for the end of former joys. On the contrary, after the vanishing of Rita Solberg, with all that she meant in the way of a delicate insouciance which Aileen had never known, his temperament ached, for he must have something like that. Truth to say, he must always have youth, the illusion of beauty, vanity in womanhood, the novelty of a new, untested temperament, quite as he must have pictures, old porcelain, music, a mansion, illuminated missals, power, the applause of the great, unthinking world. As has been said, this promiscuous attitude on Cowperwood's part was the natural flowering of a temperament that was chronically promiscuous, intellectually uncertain, and philosophically anarchistic. From one point of view it might have been said of him that he was seeking the realization of an ideal, yet to one's amazement our very ideals change at times and leave us floundering in the dark. What is an ideal, anyhow? A wraith, a mist, a perfume in the wind, a dream of fair water. The sole yearning of a girl like Antoinette Novak was a little too strained for him. It was too ardent, too clinging, and he had gradually extricated himself, not without difficulty, from that particular entanglement. Since then he had been intimate with other women for brief periods, but to no great satisfaction. Dorothy Ormsby, Jessie Bell Hinsdale, Toma Lewis, Hilda Jewell. But they shall be names merely. One was an actress, one a stenographer, one the daughter of one of his stock patrons, one a church worker, a solicitor for charity coming to him to seek help for an orphan's home. It was a pathetic mess at times, but so are all defiant variations from the accustomed drift of things. In the hardy language of Napoleon, one cannot make an omelette without cracking a number of eggs. The coming of Stephanie Platoff, Russian Jewess on one side of her family, Southwestern American on the other, was an event in Cowperwood's life. She was tall, graceful, brilliant, young, with much of the optimism of Rita Solberg, and yet endowed with a strange fatalism, which, once he knew her better, touched and moved him. He met her on shipboard on the way to Göteborg. Her father, Isidore Platoff, was a wealthy furrier of Chicago. He was a large, meaty, oily type of man, kind of ambling, gelatinous formula of the male, with the usual sound commercial instincts of the Jew, but with an errant philosophy which led him to believe first one thing and then another so long as neither interfered definitely with his business. He was an admirer of Henry George, and of so altruistic a program as that of Robert Owen, and also, in his way, a social snob. And yet he had married Susetta Osborne, a Texas girl who was once his bookkeeper. Mrs. Platoff was lithe, amiable, subtle, with an eye always to the main social chance, in other words, a climber. She was shrewd enough to realize that a knowledge of books and art and current events was essential, and so she went in for these things. It is curious how the temperaments of parents blend and revivify in their children. As Stephanie grew up, she had repeated, in her very differing body, some of her father's and mother's characteristics, an interesting variability of soul. She was tall, dark, sallow, lithe, with a strange moodiness of heart, and a recessive, fulgurous gleam in her chestnut-brown, almost brownish-black eyes. She had a full, sensuous, Cupid's mouth, a dreamy and even languishing expression, a graceful neck, and a heavy, dark, and yet pleasingly modelled face. From both her father and mother she had inherited a penchant for art, literature, philosophy, and music. Already, at 18, she was dreaming of painting, singing, writing poetry, writing books, acting, anything and everything. Serene in her own judgment of what was worthwhile, she was like to lay stress on any silly mood or fad, thinking it exquisite, the last word. Finally she was a rank voluptuary, dreaming dreams of passionate union with first one and then another type of artist, poet, musician, the whole gamut of the artistic and emotional world. Cowperwood first saw her on board the Centurion, one June morning, as the ship lay at dock in New York. He and Aileen were en route to Norway, she and her father and mother, for Denmark and Switzerland. She was hanging over the starboard rail, looking at a flock of wide-winged gulls which were besieging the port of the cook's galley. She was musing soulfully, conscious, fully, that she was musing soulfully. He paid very little attention to her, except to note that she was tall, rhythmic, and that a dark grey plaid dress and an immense veil of grey silk, wound about her shoulders and waist and over one arm after the manner of a Hindu shawl, appeared to become her much. Her face seemed very sallow, and her eyes ringed, as if indicating dyspepsia. Her black hair under a chic hat did not escape his critical eye. Later she and her father appeared at the captain's table, to which Cowperwood had also been invited. Cowperwood and Aileen did not know how to take this girl, though she interested them both. They little suspected the chameleon character of her soul. She was an artist, and as formless and unstable as water. It was a mere passing gloom that possessed her. Cowperwood liked the semi-Jewish cast of her face, a certain fullness of her neck, her dark, sleepy eyes, but she was much too young and nebulous, he thought, and he let her pass. On this trip, which endured for 10 days, he saw much of her in differing moods, walking with a young Jew in whom she seemed greatly interested, playing at shuffleboard, reading solemnly in a corner out of the reach of the wind or spray, and usually looking naive, preternaturally innocent, remote, dreamy. At other times she seemed possessed of a wild animation, her eyes alight, her expression vigorous, an intense glow in her soul. Once he saw her bent over a small wood block, cutting a book plate with a thin steel graving tool. Because of Stephanie's youth and seeming unimportance, her lack of what might be called compelling, rosy charm, Aileen had become reasonably friendly with the girl. Far subtler even at her years than Aileen, Stephanie gathered a very good impression of the former, of her mental girth, and how to take her. She made friends with her, made a book plate for her, made a sketch for her. She confided to Aileen that in her own mind she was destined for the stage, if her parents would permit, and Aileen invited her to see her husband's pictures on their return. She little knew how much a part Stephanie would play in Cowperwood's life. The Cowperwoods, having been put down at Göteborg, saw no more of the Platoffs until late October. Then Aileen, being lonely, called to see Stephanie, and occasionally thereafter Stephanie came over to the south side to see the Cowperwoods. She liked to roam about their house, to dream meditatively in some nook of the rich interior with a book for company. She liked Cowperwood's pictures, his jades, his missals, his ancient radiant glass. From talking with Aileen, she realized that the latter had no real love for these things, that her expressions of interest and pleasure were pure make-believe, based on their value as possessions. For Stephanie herself, certain of the illuminated books and bits of glass had a heavy, sensuous appeal, which only the truly artistic can understand. They unlocked dark, dream moods and pageants for her. She responded to them, lingered over them, experienced strange moods from them, as from the orchestrated richness of music, and in doing so she thought of Cowperwood often. Did he really like these things, or was he just buying them to be buying them? She had heard much of the pseudo-artistic, the people who made a show of art. She recalled Cowperwood as he walked the deck of the Centurion. She remembered his large, comprehensive, embracing, blue-gray eyes that seemed to blaze with intelligence. He seemed to her quite obviously a more forceful and significant man than her father, and yet she could not have said why. He always seemed so triggily dressed, so well put together. There was a friendly warmth about all that he said or did, though he said or did little. She felt that his eyes were mocking, that back in his soul there was some kind of humor over something which she did not understand quite. After Stephanie had been back in Chicago 6 months, during which time she saw very little of Cowperwood, who was busy with his street railway program, she was swept into the net of another interest, which carried her away from him and Aileen for the time being. On the West Side, among a circle of her mother's friends, had been organized an amateur dramatic league, with no less object than to elevate the stage. That world-old problem never fails to interest the new and the inexperienced. It all began in the home of one of the new rich of the West Side, the Timberlakes. They, in their large house on Ashland Avenue, had a stage, and Georgia Timberlake, a romantic-minded girl of 20 with flaxen hair, imagined she could act. Mrs. Timberlake, a fat, indulgent mother, rather agreed with her. The whole idea, after a few discursive performances of Milton's The Mask of Comus, Pyramus and Thisbe, and an improved Harlequin and Columbine, written by one of the members, was transferred to the realm of the studios, then quartered in the New Arts Building. An artist by the name of Lane Cross, a portrait painter, who was much less of an artist than he was a stage director, and not much of either, but who made his living by hornswaggling society into the belief that he could paint, was induced to take charge of these stage performances. By degrees, the Garrick players, as they chose to call themselves, developed no little skill and craftsmanship in presenting one form and another of classic and semi-classic play. Romeo and Juliet, with few properties of any kind, the Learned Ladies of Molière, Sheridan's The Rivals, and the Electra of Sophocles were all given. Considerable ability of one kind and another was developed, the group including 2 actresses of subsequent repute on the American stage, one of whom was Stephanie Platoff. There were some 10 girls and women among the active members, and almost as many men, a variety of characters much too extended to discuss here. There was a dramatic critic by the name of Gardner Knowles, a young man, very smug and handsome, who was connected with the Chicago press. Whipping his neatly trousered legs, with his bright little cane, he used to appear at the rooms of the players at the Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday teas, which they inaugurated, and discuss the merits of the venture. Thus, the Garrick players were gradually introduced into the newspapers. Lane Cross, the smooth-faced, pasty-souled artist who had charge, was a rake at heart, a subtle seducer of women who, however, escaped detection by a smooth, conventional bearing. He was interested in such girls as Georgia Timberlake, Irma Ottilie, a rosy, aggressive maiden who essayed comic roles, and Stephanie Platoff. These, with another girl, Ethel Tuckerman, very emotional and romantic, who could dance charmingly and sing, made up a group of friends which became very close. Presently intimacies sprang up. Only in this realm, instead of ending in marriage, they merely resulted in sex liberty. Thus Ethel Tuckerman became the mistress of Lane Cross. An illicit attachment grew up between Irma Ottilie and a young society idler by the name of Bliss Bridge. and Gardner Knowles, ardently admiring Stephanie Platoff, literally seized upon her one afternoon in her own home, when he went ostensibly to interview her, and over-persuaded her. She was only reasonably fond of him, not in love, but being generous, nebulous, passionate, emotional, inexperienced, voiceless, and vainly curious, without any sense of the meums and tieums that govern society in such matters, she allowed this rather brutal thing to happen. She was not a coward, was too nebulous and yet forceful to be such. Her parents never knew. And once so launched, another world, that of sex satisfaction, began to dawn on her. Were these young people evil? Let the social philosopher answer. One thing is certain, they did not establish homes and raise children. On the contrary, they led a gay butterfly existence for nearly 2 years. Then came a rift in the loot. Quarrels developed over parts, respective degrees of ability and leadership. Ethel Tuckerman fell out with Lane Cross, because she discovered him making love to Irma Ottley. Irma and Bliss Bridge released each other, the latter transferring his affections to Georgia Timberlake. Stephanie Platoff, by far the most individual of them all, developed a strange inconsequence as to her deeds. It was when she was drawing near the age of 20 that the affair with Gardner Knowles began. After a time, Lane Cross, with his somewhat earnest attempt at artistic interpretation, and his superiority in the matter of years, he was 40, and young Knowles only 24, seemed more interesting to Stephanie, and he was quick to respond. There followed an idle, passionate union with this man, which seemed important, but was not so at all. And then it was that Stephanie began dimly to perceive that it was on and on that blessings lie, that somewhere there might be some man much more remarkable than either of these. But this was only a dream. She thought of Cowperwood at times, but he seemed to her to be too wrapped up in grim, tremendous things, far apart from this romantic world of amateur dramatics in which she was involved. Chapter 25. Heirs from the Orient. Cowperwood gained his first real impression of Stephanie at the Garrick Players, where he went with Aileen once to witness a performance of Electra. He liked Stephanie particularly in this part, and thought her beautiful. One evening not long after, he noticed her in his own home, looking at his jades, particularly a row of bracelets and earrings. He liked the rhythmic outline of her body, which reminded him of a letter S in motion. Quite suddenly it came over him that she was a remarkable girl, very, destined perhaps to some significant future. At the same time, Stephanie was thinking of him. "Do you find these interesting?" he asked, stopping beside her. "I think they're wonderful. Those dark greens and that pale, fatty white. I can see how beautiful they would be in a Chinese setting. I've always wished we could find a Chinese or Japanese play to produce sometime." "Yes, with your black hair those earrings would look well," said Cowperwood. He had never deigned to comment on a feature of hers before. She turned her dark, brown-black eyes on him, velvety eyes with a kind of black glow in them, and now he noticed how truly fine they were, and how nice were her hands, brown almost as a Malay's. He said nothing more, but the next day an unlabeled box was delivered to Stephanie at her home, containing a pair of jade earrings, a bracelet, and a brooch with Chinese characters intagliated. Stephanie was beside herself with delight. She gathered them up in her hands and kissed them, fastening the earrings to her ears and adjusting the bracelet and ring. Despite her experience with her friends and relatives, her stage associates and her paramours, she was still a little unschooled in the world. Her heart was essentially poetic and innocent. No one had ever given her much of anything, not even her parents. Her allowance thus far in life had been a pitiful $6 a week outside of her clothing. As she surveyed these pretty things in the privacy of her room, she wondered oddly whether Cowperwood was growing to like her. Would such a strong, hard businessman be interested in her? She had heard her father say he was becoming very rich. Was she a great actress, as some said she was, and would strong, able types of men like Cowperwood take to her eventually? She had heard of Rachel, of Nell Gwynn, of the divine Sarah and her loves. She took the precious gifts and locked them in a black iron box which was sacred to her trinkets and her secrets. The mere acceptance of these things in silence was sufficient indication to Cowperwood that she was of a friendly turn of mind. He waited patiently until one day a letter came to his office, not his house, addressed Frank Algernon Cowperwood, personal. It was written in a small, neat, careful hand, almost printed. I don't know how to thank you for your wonderful present. I didn't mean you should give them to me, and I know you sent them. I shall keep them with pleasure and wear them with delight. It was so nice of you to do this. Stephanie Platoff. Cowperwood studied the handwriting, the paper, the phraseology. For a girl of only a little over 20, this was wise and reserved and tactful. She might have written to him at his residence. He gave her the benefit of a week's time, and then found her in his own home one Sunday afternoon. Aileen had gone calling, and Stephanie was pretending to await her return. "It's nice to see you in that window," he said. "You fit your background perfectly." "Do I?" The black-brown eyes burned soulfully. The paneling back of her was of dark oak, burnished by the rays of an afternoon winter sun. Stephanie Platoff had dressed for this opportunity. Her full, rich, short black hair was caught by a childish band of blood-red ribbon, holding it low over her temples and ears. Her lithe body, so harmonious in its graven roundness, was clad in an apple-green bodice and a black skirt with gussets of red about the hem. Her smooth arms, from the elbows down, were bare. On one wrist was the jade bracelet he had given her. Her stockings were apple-green silk, and despite the chill of the day her feet were shod in enticingly low slippers with brass buckles. Cowperwood retired to the hall to hang up his overcoat and came back smiling. "Isn't Mrs. Cowperwood about?" "The butler says she's out calling, but I thought I'd wait a little while anyhow. She may come back." She turned up a dark, smiling face to him with languishing, inscrutable eyes, and he recognized the artist at last, full and clear. "I see you like my bracelet, don't you?" "It's beautiful," she replied, looking down and surveying it dreamily. "I don't always wear it. I carry it in my muff. I've just put it on for a little while. I carry them all with me, always. I love them so. I like to feel them." She opened a small chamois bag beside her, lying with her handkerchief and a sketchbook, which she always carried, and took out the earrings and brooch. Cowperwood glowed with a strange feeling of approval and enthusiasm at this manifestation of real interest. He liked Jade himself very much, but more than that, the feeling that prompted this expression in another. Roughly speaking, it might have been said of him that youth and hope in women, particularly youth, when combined with beauty and ambition in a girl, touched him. He responded keenly to her impulse to do or be something in this world, whatever it might be, and he looked on the smart, egoistic vanity of so many with a kindly, tolerant, almost parental eye. Poor little organisms growing on the tree of life. They would burn out and fade soon enough. He did not know the ballad of the roses of yesteryear, but if he had, it would have appealed to him. He did not care to rifle them willy-nilly, but should their temperaments or tastes incline them in his direction, they would not suffer vastly in their lives because of him. The fact was, the man was essentially generous where women were concerned. "How nice of you," he commented, smiling. "I like that." And then seeing a notebook and pencil beside her, he asked, "What are you doing?" "Just sketching." "Let me see." "It's nothing much," she replied, deprecatingly. "I don't draw very well." "Gifted girl," he replied, picking it up. "Paints, draws, carves on wood, plays, sings, acts." "All rather badly," she sighed, turning her head languidly and looking away. In her sketchbook she had put all of her best drawings. There were sketches of nude women, dancers, torsos, bits of running figures, sad, heavy, sensuous heads and necks of sleeping girls, chins up, eyelids down, studies of her brothers and sisters, and of her father and mother. "Delightful!" exclaimed Cowperwood, keenly alive to a new treasure. Good heavens, where had been his eyes all this while? Here was a jewel lying at his doorstep, innocent, untarnished, a real jewel. These drawings suggested a fire of perception, smouldering and sombre, which thrilled him. "These are beautiful to me, Stephanie," he said simply, a strange, uncertain feeling of real affection creeping over him. The man's greatest love was for art. It was hypnotic to him. "Did you ever study art?" he asked. "No." "And you never studied acting?" "No." She shook her head in a slow, sad, enticing way. The black hair concealing her ears moved him strangely. "I know the art of your stage work is real, and you have a natural art which I just seem to see. What has been the matter with me, anyhow?" "Oh, no," she sighed. "It seems to me that I merely play at everything. I could cry sometimes when I think how I go on." "At 20? "That is old enough." She smiled archly. "Stephanie," he asked cautiously, "how old are you exactly?" "I will be 21 in April," she answered. "Have your parents been very strict with you?" She shook her head dreamily. "No. What makes you ask? They haven't paid very much attention to me. They've always liked Lucille and Gilbert and Ormond best." Her voice had a plaintive, neglected ring. It was the voice she used in her best scenes on the stage. "Don't they realize that you are very talented?" "I think perhaps my mother feels that I may have some ability. My father doesn't, I'm sure. Why?" She lifted those languorous, plaintive eyes. "Why, Stephanie, if you want to know, I think you're wonderful. I thought so the other night, when you were looking at those jades. It all came over me. You are an artist, truly, and I've been so busy I've scarcely seen it. Tell me one thing." "Yes?" She drew in a soft breath, filling her chest and expanding her bosom while she looked at him from under her black hair. Her hands were crossed idly in her lap. Then she looked demurely down. "Look, Stephanie. Look up. I want to ask you something. You have known something of me for over a year. Do you like me?" "I think you're wonderful," she murmured. "Is that all?" "Isn't that much?" She smiled, shooting a dull, black opal look in his direction. "You wore my bracelet today. Were you glad to get it?" "Oh, yes," she sighed with aspirated breath, pretending a kind of suffocation. "How beautiful you really are," he said, rising and looking down at her. She shook her head. "No." "Yes." "No." "Come, Stephanie. Stand by me and look at me. You are so tall and slender and graceful. You're like something out of Asia." She sighed, turning in a sinuous way as he slipped his arm about her. "I don't think we should we?" she asked naively after a moment, pulling away from him. "Stephanie." "I think I'd better go now, please."